Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Sophia FitzClarence, Baroness de Lisle and Dudley, the eldest and most beloved daughter of King William IV, who lived during one of Britain's most transformative eras. We'll softly explore her extraordinary journey, from her birth as an illegitimate royal child in Georgian London, through her idyllic childhood at the magnificent Bushy House estate, her devoted marriage to a baron descended from poets, her years of motherhood and loss, her father's elevation to the throne, and her final role as state housekeeper at Kensington Palace, all while Britain transformed through the Reform Act, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and entered the Victorian age that would define the 19th century. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about your favorite period of British royal history, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Georgian and early Victorian England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Sophia, later known as Baroness de Lisle, and Dudley entered the world on a late summer day, the 25th of August, 1796, in a modest but respectable townhouse on Somerset Street in the heart of Georgian London. The house stood in a neighbourhood that had seen better days, but still maintained a certain dignity, its windows overlooking the bustling cobblestone streets, where carriages clattered by and street vendors called out their wares in the peculiar symphony of London life. The city itself was alive with the energy of late 18th century England. This was London at the height of the Georgian era, a sprawling metropolis of nearly 1 million souls, the largest city in Europe, a place of extraordinary contrasts where magnificent mansions stood mere streets away from desperate poverty. The air was thick with coal smoke from thousands of chimneys, mixed with the smells of horses, cooking food, and the Thames River flowing sluggishly through the city's heart. Church bells rang out the hours across dozens of parishes, while street musicians played for coins, and newsboys shouted headlines about the war with revolutionary France that dominated everyone's thoughts. Inside the townhouse on Somerset Street, away from the noise and bustle of the city, a different kind of drama was unfolding. The birth chamber was a typically Georgian room, moderately sized, with high ceilings, tall windows that let in the late summer light, and walls probably covered in printed paper or painted in the fashionable colours of the day. A large bed dominated the space, its posts reaching toward the ceiling, its curtains drawn back to allow air to circulate. Linens had been laid out in preparation for the birth, and a fire burned in the grate even in August, for it was believed that birthing chambers should be kept warm. Dorothea Jordan lay in that bed, her labour finally complete, her body exhausted but her heart full, as she looked upon her newborn daughter. This was not Dorothea's first experience of childbirth, far from it. She already had 4 children from previous relationships, and this was her second child by Prince William. She knew the pain, the fear, the supreme effort required to bring a new life into the world. But each birth was different, each child unique, and this tiny girl, with her scrunched face and waving fists, was already capturing her mother's heart. Dorothea herself was a figure of remarkable achievement and complicated circumstances. At 35 years old, she was at the absolute peak of her theatrical career. She was not just any actress, she was the actress of her generation, the woman who could fill the Theatre Royal at Drury Lane night after night, and whose performances in comedy were considered unmatched, whose very name on a playbill guaranteed sold-out houses. Her specialty was what were called breeches roles, parts where she dressed as a young man. showing off what contemporary observers unanimously agreed were the most beautiful legs ever displayed on the English stage. This was a woman who had climbed from poverty to fame through sheer talent and determination. Born Dorothea Bland in County Waterford, Ireland, in 1761, she was the daughter of Francis Bland, a theatrical stagehand, and Grace Phillips, an actress struggling to make her way in the provincial theatre circuit. Her father had eventually abandoned the family to marry an heiress, leaving young Dorothea, her mother, and her siblings to fend for themselves. The theatre had been their salvation. Grace had trained her daughter for the stage, and Dorothea had shown natural brilliance. By the time she was in her teens, Dorothea was performing regularly in Irish theatres, but Ireland could not contain her ambitions. She had fled to England in 1782, taking the stage name Mrs. Jordan, the Mrs. giving her a veneer of respectability. Women without husbands were automatically suspect, and Jordan, symbolizing her crossing of the Irish Sea to a new life. The name stuck, and as Mrs. Jordan she had conquered the English stage, performing in York, Leeds, and finally in London, where she had become a star. But stardom had not brought her security or conventional happiness. She had loved and been abandoned, had borne children outside marriage, had supported herself and her growing family through constant work. When Prince William had first noticed her performing at Drury Lane in 1790, she had been a 30-year-old actress with 4 children to support, wary of men's promises, but still capable of hope. William had been different from the others, or so it had seemed. He was crude and unpretentious, genuinely funny, refreshingly honest about what he wanted. And what he wanted was not just a brief affair, but a real relationship, a partnership, something approaching a marriage in all but legal status. Now, 6 years into that relationship, lying in her birthing chamber with her newborn daughter in her arms, Dorothea had reason to believe that hope had been justified. She and William had created something real together. Not just children, but a family, a home, a life. They lived together openly, raising their children in a household that functioned like any respectable family's home. Yes, they could not marry legally. The Royal Marriages Act made that impossible. But in practice, they were as married as any couple could be. Outside the birthing chamber, Prince William Henry, Duke of Clarence, and St. Andrews, third son of King George III, paced with the nervous energy that has characterized expectant fathers since time immemorial. At 31 years old, William was a curious mixture of royal privilege and genuine rough-edged humanity. He had been born to extraordinary circumstances. His father was the King of England. His mother was Queen Charlotte. His childhood had been spent in palaces surrounded by servants and protocol. But unlike his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, who had embraced luxury and refinement, William had been sent to sea at 13 and had spent his formative years in the Royal Navy. The Navy had shaped him profoundly. He had learned to command men, to navigate by the stars, to face danger with courage, and to appreciate competence over aristocratic pretension. He had served in the Caribbean, had fought in actual battles, had formed friendships with common sailors, and had earned their respect through his willingness to share their hardships. When other princes might turn up their noses at coarse language or rough manners, William would laugh and join in, feeling more comfortable in a ship's wardroom than in a palace drawing room. His naval career had ended in 1790 when he retired from active service, having reached the rank of Rear Admiral. The reasons for his retirement were complex. Partly, it was family pressure to settle down. Partly, it was the limited opportunities for further advancement without seeming to receive special treatment. And partly, it was his own desire for a different kind of life. He had seen enough of the sea. Now he wanted a home, a family. the domestic happiness that his career had not provided. That happiness had come in the form of Dorothea Jordan. Their meeting had been almost cliché. A prince sees an actress on stage and is smitten. But what developed afterward was anything but cliché. William genuinely loved Dorothea, not just for her beauty or her theatrical talent, but for her wit, her warmth, her competence in running a household, her ability to make him laugh, and her evident capacity for deep affection. And she loved him in return. I'd seeing past the royal title to the man beneath, sometimes ridiculous, often endearing, fundamentally decent despite his limitations. When the midwife finally emerged from the birthing chamber to announce that Dorothea had safely delivered a healthy baby girl, William's relief was palpable. Childbirth was dangerous in 1796. Even wealthy women with access to the best midwives and physicians died regularly in labor, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Every successful birth was a victory against the odds, a reason for thanksgiving. William was allowed into the chamber to meet his daughter. The baby was tiny, as all newborns are, with the reddish complexion and slightly scrunched features common to infants just hours old. Her eyes, when she opened them, were the unfocused blue that all babies have, and which might darken to brown or stay blue as she grew. She had a surprisingly full head of dark hair, and when she grasped her father's finger with her tiny fist, William felt his heart contract with protective love. The name they chose for her carried significance beyond its simple elegance. Sophia was named for Princess Sophia, one of William's many sisters, a woman who lived a quiet, constrained life at court, never permitted to marry, forever dependent on her father, and then her brothers for support. Perhaps in naming this child Sophia, they hoped for a different future, that this Sophia would know love and independence that Princess Sophia could never experience. The surname would be FitzClarence, carefully chosen to acknowledge both paternity and status. In Norman French, Fitz meant son of, and throughout English history, and it had been used for royal bastards, Fitzroy for son of the king, Fitzjames for son of James. FitzClarence thus meant son or daughter of Clarence, referring to William's ducal title. The name announced to anyone who heard it exactly what this child was: the illegitimate offspring of a prince, acknowledged but not legitimized, connected to royalty, but forever barred from its formal privileges. Little Sophia's first year unfolded in the relative comfort and privacy of Clarence Lodge, a house in Roehampton, in the southwestern outskirts of London. The lodge was William's residence, granted to him as part of his position and income as a royal duke. It was not palatial. The Prince of Wales had palaces, the king had castles, but it was comfortable, spacious enough for a growing family, and surrounded by enough grounds to provide some privacy from the curious eyes of the public. The neighbourhood of Roehampton in 1796 was a pleasant semi-rural area, far enough from central London to escape the worst of the city's smoke and noise, yet close enough to maintain convenient access to theatres, shopping and society. The area was popular with wealthy merchants and minor aristocrats who wanted country houses within easy reach of town. The roads were better than most, important for William, who frequently had business in London and needed to travel back and forth. Inside Clarence Lodge, the rhythms of life followed the timeless patterns dictated by the needs of an infant. Sophia nursed frequently. Babies in this era were typically breastfed by their mothers if the mother was able and willing, or by wet nurses if circumstances required. Dorothea, despite her theatrical commitments, seems to have nursed at least some of her children herself, though she certainly also employed wet nurses when her performance schedule demanded it. The household itself was a bustling operation. Beyond William, Dorothea, and the two children, George, now 2 years old, and infant Sophia, There were numerous servants required to maintain even a moderately sized establishment. There would have been a butler to manage the male servants, a housekeeper to manage the female servants, footmen to serve at table and run errands, maids for cleaning and maintaining the house, a cook and kitchen staff, nursemaids to help care for the children, stable hands for the horses and carriages, and probably several other specialized servants for specific tasks. Managing such a household was a significant undertaking, requiring organizational skills, financial management, and the ability to balance competing demands. Dorothea, despite having no formal training in household management, proved remarkably capable at this. Perhaps her years managing her own career, negotiating contracts, handling money, organizing her schedule, had taught her skills that transferred well to domestic management. But household management was only part of Dorothea's responsibilities. She was still performing regularly at Drury Lane and other London theatres. This meant leaving Clarence Lodge, often in late afternoon, travelling to the theatre for evening performances, and returning home late at night. Sometimes she would be engaged for weeks at a time, performing 6 nights a week with only Sundays off, and the schedule was exhausting, especially for a woman who had recently given birth. Yet she persisted because she had to. William's financial situation, like that of most of King George III's sons, was perpetually precarious. The king himself was notoriously tight-fisted when it came to supporting his adult children, and Parliament granted each royal duke an allowance that was generous by ordinary standards, but utterly insufficient for maintaining the lifestyle expected of royalty. William's annual allowance was meant to support a single prince, not a prince with a partner and a growing family. Dorothea's theatrical earnings were substantial. At the height of her career, she could command fees of £50 per performance or more, an extraordinary sum when most working-class families lived on £30 per year, even after paying her agent, buying costumes, and covering other professional expenses. She earned enough to significantly supplement William's income. This money helped keep the household running, paid servants' wages, bought food and fuel, covered the costs of maintaining carriages and horses, and generally kept them from falling into the debt that plagued most of William's royal brothers. For infant Sophia, blissfully unaware of these adult concerns, life in her first year revolved around basic needs and simple comforts. She nursed and slept, cried when uncomfortable, and cooed when content. She was held by her mother's arms, her father's rougher hands, the gentler touch of nursemaids and servants who helped care for her. She heard voices, her mother's melodious tones trained by years of theatrical projection, in her father's booming laugh and navy vocabulary, the softer voices of servants, and the babbling of her toddler brother George. As months passed, Sophia reached the universal milestones of infancy. She learned to focus her eyes and track movement. She discovered her hands and feet, staring at them with the fascination that suggests a dawning awareness of self. She smiled at familiar faces and cried when strangers approached. She began to roll over, then to sit up with support, then to sit independently. These developments, unremarkable in themselves, were the building blocks of the person she would become. The world beyond Clarence Lodge continued its tumultuous course. Britain remained locked in war with revolutionary France. The French had executed their king, Louis XVI, in 1793, sending shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. Queen Marie Antoinette had followed her husband to the guillotine later that same year. The revolution had descended into the Terror, where thousands died under the blade of the guillotine in a paroxysm of political violence. Now, by 1796, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte was beginning his meteoric rise to power, winning battles in Italy that would make him France's greatest military hero. In Britain, the war effort consumed enormous resources. The Royal Navy, William's former service, fought to maintain control of the seas and prevent a French invasion. The army fought on the European continent and in various colonial theatres. The government imposed taxes to fund the war, and there were periodic food shortages and economic disruptions that affected everyone from aristocrats to labourers. Inside Clarence Lodge, these great events were distant thunder, felt and discussed, but not immediately threatening. William, frustrated at being kept ashore despite his naval experience, followed war news avidly, corresponded with naval colleagues, and wished he could return to active service. Dorothea, with her Irish background and theatrical circles, heard different perspectives on the war and on politics generally, but their primary focus was on their growing family and the daily challenges of running a household. In January 1797, when Sophia was just 5 months old, everything changed for the better in a way that would shape the rest of her childhood. King George III, in a gesture that combined practical necessity with genuine paternal affection for his third son, appointed Prince William as Ranger of Bushy Park. This position, which had become vacant with the death of the previous holder, came with an extraordinary perk that would transform the family's circumstances. Residence at Bushy House. Bushy House was far more than just a house. It was a substantial country residence set within the magnificent grounds of Bushy Park in Teddington, Middlesex. To understand what this move meant for William, Dorothea, and their young family, we must understand something of both the house and the park. The house itself had been built earlier in the 18th century for George Montague, Earl of Halifax, between 1714 and 1715. Halifax had been a wealthy and influential nobleman, serving as First Lord of the Treasury and other high offices, and he had the resources to build a house that reflected his status. The result was a substantial brick residence of considerable elegance, not a palace in the continental sense, but a proper gentleman's seat that commanded respect. The architecture was classic early Georgian, symmetrical facade, elegant proportions, sash windows, and those subtle details of craftsmanship that separated truly fine houses from merely large ones. The interior featured high-ceilinged rooms with elaborate plasterwork, wide staircases with beautiful balustrades, and all the amenities expected in a house of this quality. There was a formal drawing room for entertaining guests, a dining room for elegant meals, a library for quiet reading and study, numerous bedchambers for family and guests, and separate quarters for servants. The kitchen and service areas were extensive, designed to support a household of significant size. But the real glory of Bushy House was not the building itself, impressive though it was, but its setting within Bushy Park. This royal park encompassed over 1,000 acres of woodland, meadow, and carefully designed landscape. It had been a royal hunting ground since the time of Henry VIII, though by the late 18th century, hunting had given way to more genteel uses. The park was home to herds of red and fallow deer that roamed freely through the landscape, descended from deer that had grazed these grounds for centuries. The most spectacular feature of Bushy Park was undoubtedly the Chestnut Avenue, a magnificent tree-lined avenue stretching nearly a mile through the park, and this avenue consisted of 4 rows of horse chestnut trees, creating a natural cathedral of extraordinary beauty. The trees had been planted earlier in the century, and by 1797 had reached mature magnificence. In spring, they would explode with white blossoms, creating clouds of flowers that seemed to float above the ground. In summer, their broad leaves provided cooling shade for those walking or riding beneath them. In autumn, their leaves turned gold and bronze, carpeting the ground with colour, while children gathered the glossy brown chestnuts that fell in abundance. In winter, their bare branches created intricate patterns against grey skies, their silhouettes stark and beautiful. Beyond the formal avenue, the park encompassed a variety of landscapes, and there were ancient woodlands where oak and beech trees had stood for centuries, their trunks massive, their branches spreading wide, their roots deep in English soil. There were open meadows where deer grazed and wildflowers bloomed in season, primroses and bluebells in spring, daisies and buttercups in summer. There were ponds and streams, part of the network of waterways that fed the River Thames not far away. There were formal gardens closer to the house, with geometric beds, carefully tended roses, and the ornamental features fashionable in landscape design. For Prince William, the appointment as ranger came with both honour and responsibility. The ranger was responsible for overseeing the park, managing the deer herd, maintaining the grounds, and generally ensuring that this royal property remained in good condition. It was not a sinecure. Real work was involved, though of course much of the actual labour would be performed by gamekeepers, groundskeepers, and other workers under the ranger's supervision. But the position carried prestige, came with the magnificent residence, and helped legitimise William's domestic arrangements in a way that simple cohabitation at Clarence Lodge had not. The move to Bushy House in early 1797 was probably a major undertaking. Entire households had to be packed and transported. Furniture, clothing, dishes, linens, personal possessions, servants, and of course the children. The distance from Roehampton to Teddington was not great, perhaps 10 miles, but moving even that distance in the 1790s required careful planning and multiple trips by cart and carriage. For 5-month-old Sophia, and the move meant nothing. She was too young to have formed attachments to any particular place, or to notice the difference between one room and another. But for 2-year-old George, the move must have been confusing and perhaps frightening, as his familiar world was disassembled and reassembled in a new location. For Dorothea, the move represented both opportunity and challenge. The opportunity was obvious. Bushy House was far grander than Clarence Lodge, offering more space, more prestige, a more secure base for raising their family. The challenge was equally obvious. Managing a much larger household, establishing routines in a new place, and dealing with the increased visibility that came with living in such a prominent residence. For William, the move was unambiguously positive. He had his own proper establishment now, his own domain where he was master. He could entertain guests appropriately, could exercise his responsibilities as ranger, could live like the prince he was rather than skulking in a moderate house in Roehampton. And most importantly, he could provide his children with a childhood environment that was both beautiful and secure. As Sophia grew from infant to toddler to child, Bushy House became the centre of her universe, her earliest conscious memories, those vague, dreamlike fragments that everyone retains from early childhood, would have been formed in these rooms and these grounds. The house's walls, the park's trees, the deer grazing in the meadows, the changing seasons in the gardens. These would become so familiar as to seem inevitable, the unchanging backdrop against which her childhood unfolded. The house itself offered endless opportunities for exploration as Sophia grew old enough to toddle about. Every room had its character and purpose. The formal drawing room, with its elegant furniture and careful decoration, was for entertaining important guests, not a place for children to play, but a place they might be brought in their best clothes to be shown to visitors. The library, with its shelves of leather-bound books reaching toward the ceiling, smelled of paper and leather and knowledge, a quiet refuge where her father might read newspapers and correspondence. The dining room, with its long table and silver service, was where the family gathered for formal meals, learning the manners and conversation expected of well-bred people. But there were also less formal spaces where children were welcome, and there was probably a nursery wing, where Sophia and her growing number of siblings spent much of their time under the supervision of nursemaids. These rooms would have been furnished with small beds, toy chests, perhaps a rocking horse or doll house, and all the paraphernalia of childhood. There would have been a schoolroom where lessons took place once the children reached the appropriate age. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and all the other subjects considered essential for their education. The servants' quarters, though children of the family were not supposed to spend much time there, nevertheless held a certain fascination. The kitchen, with its enormous fireplace and the constant activity of cooking, the smell of bread baking and meat roasting, the clatter of pots and pans, these sensory experiences would have been captivating to a curious child. The servants themselves, from the dignified butler to the youngest scullery maid, represented a whole social hierarchy that children observed and learned from. But the real magic of Bushy House lay outside its walls, in the 1,000 acres of park that surrounded it. For Sophia and her siblings, this was their playground, their classroom, their adventure ground, their entire world. In spring, the park came alive with new growth and new life. The trees leafed out, transforming from winter skeletons to full green canopies. The chestnut avenue burst into bloom, its white flowers creating a spectacle that drew visitors from across the region. The meadows carpeted themselves with wildflowers, primroses first, their pale yellow petals appearing even before the grass greened fully, then bluebells creating sheets of purple blue that stretched beneath the trees in the woodlands. The deer gave birth to their fawns, wobbly-legged creatures with spotted coats, who stayed close to their mothers in the dangerous first weeks of life. Children at Bushy House could run through meadows still wet with morning dew, could pick wildflowers by the armful, could watch baby birds in nests and tadpoles in ponds. They could climb trees, carefully, with warnings from anxious nurses ringing in their ears, and see the world from heights that made them feel like they were flying. They could play games of hide-and-seek among the ancient trees, could build fortresses from fallen branches, could pretend they were explorers discovering new lands. Summer brought long, golden days when sunset came late and bedtime seemed an unwelcome interruption to outdoor adventures. The heat could be oppressive. Summers in England, though rarely extreme by continental standards, could still be uncomfortably hot, especially for children dressed in the layers required by contemporary fashion. But there were shady places beneath the trees and cool streams where one might wade if daring enough to risk wet clothes and parental disapproval. The deer, used to human presence after centuries of coexistence, would sometimes approach quite close, especially if children had brought apples or other treats. To see these graceful animals up close, to watch a stag with his magnificent antlers, or a doe with her delicate features, to observe the way they moved through their world with such ease. This was magic to a child, and the kind of experience that remains vivid decades later. There were organized activities as well as free play. The children learned to ride, first on patient ponies and then on larger horses as they grew. Riding was an essential skill for anyone of their class, necessary for transportation, for social activities like hunting, and simply for the pleasure of it. Sophia would have started young, perhaps as young as 4 or 5, sitting on a gentle pony led by a groom, gradually learning balance and control and confidence. They also learned to navigate the social world of the countryside. There were other aristocratic families in the area, and children from neighbouring estates might visit or be visited. These interactions taught important lessons about hierarchy, manners, and appropriate behaviour in different contexts, and Sophia learned how to greet adult visitors politely, how to entertain guest children graciously, how to behave in someone else's home, and how to navigate the complex social rules that governed even children's interactions in this era. Autumn brought its own beauty and activities. The leaves changed colour, creating tapestries of red, gold and orange against the grey English skies. Chestnuts fell from the trees in the famous avenue, and children gathered them, not to eat. Horse chestnuts are inedible to humans, but for the simple pleasure of collecting these smooth, glossy treasures. Or perhaps for games like conkers, where chestnuts on strings were smashed against each other in a test of strength. The harvest season meant activity throughout the region, though Bushy Park itself was not farmland, and the surrounding countryside was agricultural, and harvest time was crucial for ensuring food supplies through the winter. Children might observe the cutting of grain, the gathering of hay, the bringing in of autumn fruits and vegetables. They learned the rhythms of the agricultural year, the connection between seasons and food, the work required to sustain life. Winter could be harsh. The great house, for all its elegance, was difficult to heat. Fires blazed in every occupied room, but corridors were cold, upper floors were frigid, and children learned to huddle near the hearth for warmth. They wore multiple layers of clothing, wrapped themselves in shawls and blankets, and accepted cold as an inevitable part of winter life. But winter had its compensations. When snow fell, it transformed the park into a wonderland. The deer's tracks became visible in the white expanse. Children could throw snowballs, build snowmen, and slide on icy patches. When ponds froze solid enough, there was ice skating, a popular pastime that required balance, courage, and a willingness to risk bruises from falls. Christmas was celebrated with traditional festivities. There would be special foods, roasted meats, plum pudding, mince pies, and gifts for the children. Religious observance was important, with attendance at church services on Christmas Day and the days following. The 12 days of Christmas, from Christmas Eve through Epiphany on January 6th, were a season of celebration, a break from routine, a time when even servants might receive extra wages and small gifts from their employers. As the years passed at Bushy House, the family continued to grow with remarkable regularity. After George, born 1794, and Sophia, born 1796, the children continued to arrive with the frequency common in an era without reliable birth control. In 1798, when Sophia was 2 years old, her sister Mary was born. Mary would be described as a fine-looking brown girl with a pleasant countenance and manners, the brown referring to her darker colouring, perhaps darker hair, or a complexion that tanned easily. Every child has their own personality from birth, and Mary's seems to have been outgoing and friendly, complementing Sophia's wit and charm with a different but equally appealing manner. Frederick arrived in 1799, a robust boy who would follow his father into military service. Elizabeth was born in January 1801, eventually becoming Countess of Errol through marriage and mother to descendants, who would include future princesses and a prime minister. Augusta came in November 1803, a girl whose life would be marked by both joy and tragedy. Augustus appeared in February 1805, destined for the unusual path of becoming a clergyman, despite his royal blood. And finally, Amelia was born in March 1807, the baby of the family and the last of the FitzClarence children. There were also children who did not survive. Henry Edward, born in 1795 between George and Sophia, would die young in India. Other pregnancies may have ended in miscarriage or produced infants who died shortly after birth. Such losses were tragically common and often went unrecorded. By 1807, when Amelia was born and Sophia was 11 years old, Bushy House contained a remarkable brood. 10 children ranging from infants to teenagers, all surnamed FitzClarence, all acknowledged by their father, but bearing the permanent mark of illegitimacy, all growing up in this unique environment that was neither fully royal nor fully ordinary. The relationships between these siblings were complex and profound. They were raised together, shared the same unusual circumstances, faced the same social challenges, and developed bonds that would last throughout their lives. Sophia, as the eldest daughter, and occupied a particular position in this sibling constellation. She was old enough to remember a time before some of her younger siblings existed, old enough to help care for babies and toddlers, young enough to still enjoy play and adventure, but increasingly aware of the responsibilities that would come with adulthood. The age spread meant different children occupied different developmental stages simultaneously. When Sophia was 11, George was 13 and entering the turbulent years of adolescence. Mary was 9, Frederick 8, Elizabeth 6, Augusta 3, Augustus 2, and Amelia just an infant. Managing this range of ages and needs required considerable organizational skill and ample staff. The children's education was taken seriously despite their irregular status. Tutors were employed to teach the boys, and as was standard for aristocratic families, the girls also received education, which was less universal in this era. Many aristocratic families considered minimal education sufficient for girls, who were destined for marriage rather than careers. But William and Dorothea ensured their daughters learned to read and write fluently, studied arithmetic and geography, learned French, the language of courts and diplomacy, studied history, and acquired the accomplishments expected of well-bred young ladies: music, drawing, dancing, and needlework. For Sophia specifically, these years of education from roughly age 6 to age 14 shaped her intellectual development and equipped her for the life ahead. She learned to read with fluency and pleasure, opening worlds through books that physical travel could not provide. She studied geography and learned about the vast British Empire her grandfather ruled, about distant continents and exotic peoples, about the places her father had sailed in his naval career. History lessons traced the monarchs of England backward through time, creating a genealogical map in which her own family appeared as a peculiar side branch, connected to the throne but unable to inherit it. Mathematics was probably not Sophia's favorite subject. It rarely was for children in this era, when the pedagogy focused on rote memorization rather than understanding. But she learned enough arithmetic to manage household accounts, to understand money and budgets, to handle the practical mathematics required in daily life. French lessons were more engaging. It taught, perhaps by a French émigré. There were many French nobles and their dependents living in England, having fled the Revolution and its aftermath. Speaking French was essential for anyone who wished to move in cultured society. It was the language of diplomacy, the language in which much literature was written, the language that educated Europeans used to communicate across national boundaries. Music lessons were a standard part of any girl's education. Sophia learned to play the pianoforte, sitting at the instrument for hours of practice, her fingers learning the patterns required to produce melodies and harmonies. She may have learned to sing as well. Her mother, after all, was famous for her voice. Though Dorothea's talents were theatrical rather than operatic, these musical skills were not intended to make Sophia a professional musician, but to make her an accomplished lady who could entertain in social settings. Drawing and painting were equally important accomplishments. Sophia learned to sketch landscapes, to paint watercolors, to create the kind of decorative art that ladies displayed in albums and sketchbooks. This skill, developed in childhood, would serve her in a poignant way decades later, when she created a watercolor portrait of her dying father. Dancing lessons taught both social skills and physical grace. The children learned the formal court dances, the stately minuet, the elegant cotillion, as well as the livelier country dances popular at less formal gatherings. These lessons were not just about steps and movements, but about deportment, about how to carry oneself with grace, about how to move through social situations with confidence and poise. Needlework encompassed both practical sewing, the ability to make and repair clothing, and decorative embroidery. Girls learned various stitches, worked on samplers demonstrating their skill, and created decorative pieces for display. This was considered an essential female accomplishment, something respectable women did to occupy their hands while socializing or during quiet evening hours. But beyond formal lessons, Sophia received another kind of education that perhaps shaped her even more profoundly. She learned by observing and participating in the life around her. She watched her mother manage the household, learning by example how to oversee servants, plan meals, organize domestic life. She observed her parents' relationship, the affection between them, and the way they negotiated decisions, the partnership they had created despite its unconventional nature. She watched how her father dealt with political matters, received guests, managed his responsibilities as ranger. She absorbed lessons about class, power, gender, and society simply by living within her particular family and social position. She also learned about the precariousness of their position. She understood, as she grew older, that while they lived in a great house and her father was a prince, they were not truly part of the royal family in the formal sense. She noticed how some visitors treated them with respect, while others showed condescension or disapproval. She experienced the peculiar social position of being simultaneously elevated and stigmatized, of having privileges many would envy, while being denied things that seem simple and automatic for legitimate children. Throughout Sophia's childhood, her mother remained a figure of complexity, simultaneously present and absent, devoted and distracted, theatrical and maternal. Understanding Dorothea's role in Sophia's life requires understanding the demands of Dorothea's theatrical career and the financial necessity that kept her performing, even as her family grew. Dorothea Jordan, in the late 1790s and early 1800s, was at the absolute peak of her powers as a performer. Contemporary reviews and accounts describe her as having a voice of extraordinary beauty and flexibility, perfect comic timing, and a natural, unaffected style that made even the most artificial theatrical situations seem real and believable. And when she appeared on stage, she didn't seem to be acting. She seemed to simply be, inhabiting her character so completely that audiences forgot they were watching a performance. Her specialty, as mentioned, was comedy, and particularly what were called breeches roles, parts where she dressed in men's clothing. These roles were popular in the 18th and early 19th centuries, allowing actresses to show their figures in ways that ordinary women's dress concealed, while maintaining a veneer of respectability because they were in character. Dorothea's legs, displayed in tight-fitting breeches and hose, were legendary, and one contemporary observer wrote that she had the most beautiful legs ever seen on the English stage, and her appearances in roles like Sir Harry Wildair or Rosalind in As You Like It were guaranteed to fill theatres. But it wasn't just her legs that audiences came to see. It was her total performance. She could make people laugh until they cried, could deliver comic lines with perfect timing, could combine physical comedy with witty dialogue, and could create characters that felt real and sympathetic, even in the most farcical situations. She performed in Shakespeare's comedies, Viola in Twelfth Night, Rosalind in As You Like It, Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. She performed in popular contemporary comedies and farces. She even occasionally took on dramatic roles, though comedy was always her strength. Managing this career while raising a growing family required extraordinary organizational skill and physical stamina. A typical arrangement might involve Dorothea performing in London for several weeks at a time, arriving at the theatre in late afternoon for preparation, performing in the evening, returning home late at night, rising the next day to do it all again. She might perform 6 nights per week, with only Sundays off for rest and religious observance. During these performing periods, she would see her children primarily during daytime hours and on Sundays. She would breakfast with them, perhaps spend a few hours in their company, and then prepare for the evening's performance. The children would be put to bed by nursemaids, and Dorothea would return home after they were asleep. It was not ideal, but it was necessary. Her earnings helped keep the household solvent. When she wasn't actively performing, Dorothea threw herself into domestic life with apparent genuine pleasure. She enjoyed being with her children, teaching them, playing with them, simply watching them grow and develop. She was, by all accounts, a warm and affectionate mother when present, capable of combining discipline with genuine tenderness. For Sophia, this pattern of maternal presence and absence created a particular kind of relationship. When her mother was home, Sophia had her full attention and affection. Dorothea would hold her, talk to her, answer her questions, teach her songs and stories, provide the kind of maternal presence every child craves. But then Dorothea would leave for another engagement, and Sophia would be left with nursemaids and other caregivers who, however competent and kind, were not her mother. This created in Sophia a deep appreciation for her mother's presence when available, but also perhaps some understanding of adult responsibilities and necessities. She learned early that love did not mean constant physical presence, that parents had obligations beyond their children, that the world made demands that sometimes took precedence over family life. These were mature lessons for a child to learn, but Sophia seemed to absorb them without apparent resentment. The financial aspect was impossible to ignore, even for children. The FitzClarence household existed in a constant state of financial stress, despite Dorothea's earnings and William's allowance. The costs of maintaining Bushy House, employing sufficient staff, and educating 10 children, and maintaining the lifestyle expected of a royal duke were enormous. Debts accumulated despite everyone's best efforts. Creditors sent increasingly insistent bills. Economies were attempted and abandoned. The spectre of financial disaster hovered constantly in the background. Dorothea bore much of this burden. She negotiated her theatrical contracts to maximize income. She economized in household management where possible. She probably worried constantly about money in a way that her aristocratic partner, raised with wealth and never really understanding its absence, did not fully appreciate, and she kept performing year after year, even as her body aged and the work became more exhausting, because the money was needed. For Sophia, watching her mother carry this burden must have been an education in itself, as she learned that even wealthy households could be financially precarious, that maintaining appearances cost money, that women might need to support their families through their own work, and that love and duty sometimes required enormous sacrifice. To understand Sophia's childhood and adolescence, we must understand the broader historical context in which it unfolded. From the time of her birth in 1796 until well into her teenage years, Britain was locked in a titanic struggle with revolutionary and then Napoleonic France, a conflict that would eventually span more than 2 decades and reshape Europe's political landscape forever. The French Revolution had erupted in 1789, 7 years before Sophia's birth, with the storming of the Bastille prison and the collapse of the French monarchy's authority. What began as a movement for constitutional reform and political liberty had rapidly radicalized producing increasingly extreme measures. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had been executed by guillotine in 1793, shocking monarchies throughout Europe and confirming their worst fears about where revolutionary ideology might lead. Britain had initially remained somewhat aloof from these continental upheavals, but by 1793, it had joined the coalition of powers fighting against revolutionary France. The reasons were multiple: genuine horror at the execution of fellow monarchs, fear that revolutionary ideas might spread to Britain and inspire domestic unrest, concern about French territorial expansion, and the perennial British strategy of preventing any single power from dominating the European continent. The war against revolutionary France had its ups and downs throughout the 1790s. The French armies, despite, or perhaps because of, their revolutionary fervour, proved formidable opponents. They introduced new tactics, mobilized unprecedented numbers of soldiers through mass conscription, and fought with an ideological commitment that professional armies of the old order found difficult to match. Britain's primary contributions were naval power. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports and protected British commerce, and financial support for continental allies who did much of the actual land fighting. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France in 1799 through a coup d'etat, establishing himself first as first consul and later as emperor, the war had already been going on for 6 years. Napoleon transformed it from a revolutionary crusade into a more traditional war of conquest and domination. Though still clothed in revolutionary rhetoric, he proved himself a military genius of the First Order, winning stunning victories against Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Britain remained his most persistent enemy, protected from invasion by the English Channel and by the Royal Navy's dominance at sea. The threat of French invasion was real enough that defensive preparations were undertaken, coastal fortifications built, militia units trained, contingency plans developed, but the invasion never came, largely because Napoleon could never quite solve the problem of how to get his armies across the Channel when the Royal Navy controlled the waters between. For the FitzClarence family at Bushy House, the war was simultaneously distant and ever-present. It was distant in that no fighting occurred on British soil, except in occasional small-scale raids, and daily life in Teddington continued with relative normality. But it was ever-present in the constant war news, the anxieties about national survival, the economic disruptions caused by naval blockades and trade restrictions, and the personal connections many families had to serving military men. Prince William chafed at his enforced idleness. Here he was, an experienced naval officer with years of command experience, sitting ashore while younger men fought and won glory at sea, or he followed the naval war obsessively, reading dispatches and newspapers, corresponding with serving officers, analyzing strategies and tactics. When news arrived of great victories like the Battle of the Nile in 1798, where Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet in Egypt, or the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where Nelson won his greatest victory but lost his life, William celebrated but also mourned his absence from the action. The children absorbed their father's interest in naval affairs. They learned the names of famous ships and commanders. They heard stories of great battles and heroic deeds. They understood that their nation was engaged in an existential struggle, that French victory would mean invasion and conquest, and that only Britain's navy and her allies' armies stood between their comfortable world and catastrophe. Another factor shaping the historical moment was King George III's recurring mental illness. Sophia's grandfather, the king, had suffered his first major breakdown in 1788, exhibiting symptoms that have been variously diagnosed by modern scholars as porphyria, bipolar disorder, or some other mental illness. He recovered from that episode and functioned normally for years afterward, But in 1810, when Sophia was 14 years old, the king suffered another severe breakdown from which he would never fully recover. His symptoms were distressing. He spoke continuously and incoherently, suffered from delusions and hallucinations, became physically ill, and was clearly incapable of performing his royal duties. After months of hoping for recovery, Parliament finally passed the Regency Act in February 1811, officially recognising that the king was incapable of ruling and transferring his powers to the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent. This transition had significant implications for the royal family and the nation. The Prince Regent, later King George IV, was very different from his father, more extravagant in spending, more interested in art and culture, more politically savvy, but also more cynical. His personal life was notoriously scandalous. He had married secretly and illegally to a Catholic widow, Mrs. Fitzherbert, then married officially, but disastrously, to Princess Caroline of Brunswick, with whom he had one daughter, Princess Charlotte, before separating permanently. For Prince William and his family, the regency meant dealing with his eldest brother rather than his father. The relationship between the two brothers was complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, coloured by the usual rivalries that develop in large families where hierarchy and precedence matter enormously. The king's madness also raised uncomfortable questions about hereditary mental illness in the royal family. Multiple members of the Hanoverian line showed signs of psychological instability. William's brother George, though politically astute, was certainly neurotic and hypochondriacal. Other siblings showed various personality disorders. The question of whether this ran in families, whether it might be passed to children, was understood intuitively, if not scientifically. For Sophia and her siblings, descendants of this troubled lineage, there must have been some anxiety about what traits they might have inherited. By 1810, Prince William's financial situation had deteriorated from merely difficult to genuinely desperate. His debts had mounted to truly staggering levels, tens of thousands of pounds owed to creditors of every description. The annual allowance Parliament granted him could not begin to cover his expenses, let alone pay down existing debts. Dorothea's theatrical earnings, substantial though they were, represented but a fraction of what was needed. The reasons for this financial disaster were multiple and interrelated. Partly, it was the simple cost of maintaining Bushy House and supporting a large household. 10 children, even with economies, require enormous expenditure: food, clothing, education, servants to care for them, medical care when needed. Partly, it was William's unwillingness to economize in ways that might diminish his dignity or disadvantage his children. He wanted his sons and daughters to have educations befitting royal children, to dress well, to be presented in society appropriately. But partly, it was also the simple fact that royal allowances in this era never matched royal expectations or social demands. Parliament was perpetually reluctant to vote sufficient funds for the monarch's adult children, partly from genuine concern about cost and partly from political considerations. Voting money to unpopular princes was politically risky, yet those same princes were expected to maintain establishments befitting their rank, to entertain appropriately, to dress fashionably, to project royal dignity through material display. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. Adding to William's stress was growing pressure from political quarters about the succession. With Princess Charlotte as the Prince Regent's only child, and with the Prince Regent's marriage irretrievably broken and unlikely to produce more children, the succession after Charlotte was uncertain. It might pass to Prince Frederick, Duke of York, William's next older brother. But Frederick was childless and separated from his wife. If both Charlotte and Frederick failed to produce heirs, the succession might fall to William. And herein lay the problem. William had 10 children, but all were illegitimate and thus barred from succession. If he were to become heir presumptive or even king, having 10 bastard children by an actress would be a significant political liability. There were whispers, probably reaching William through his political connections, that he would need to marry properly, to produce legitimate heirs who could continue the line. These whispers became more insistent as the financial pressure grew. Creditors suggested that marriage to a wealthy woman, an heiress with a substantial fortune, could solve his financial problems. Political advisors suggested that marriage to a proper princess could solve his succession problems. Family members probably added their voices, arguing that at some point, William needed to think about duty and dynasty rather than personal happiness. For William, this created an impossible dilemma. He loved Dorothea. After 20 years together, and she was his partner in every sense except the legal one. They had built a family together, had created a home together, had shared joys and sorrows. He loved his children and enjoyed his domestic life. The prospect of abandoning all this for a marriage of dynastic convenience must have been deeply unappealing. But the pressure was relentless. The debts grew. The political arguments became harder to ignore. And William, for all his genuine affection for Dorothea and their children, was still fundamentally a prince, raised to put duty before personal desire, to accept that royal status came with obligations that ordinary people did not face. The year 1811 would be remembered by Sophia for the rest of her life as the year when her childhood paradise was destroyed, when the security and happiness she had known at Bushy House came crashing down, leaving her and her siblings to navigate an uncertain and painful future. The separation of William and Dorothea was probably negotiated through intermediaries over a period of months, rather than decided in a single dramatic moment. Lawyers would have been involved, drawing up terms and conditions. Financial advisors would have calculated what Dorothea could reasonably be expected to live on. Political counselors would have advised on how to manage the public relations aspects of dissolving a 20-year relationship that everyone knew about. The terms finally agreed upon followed a pattern common in such aristocratic separations. Dorothea would receive an annual allowance of £1,600 per year, a substantial sum by middle-class standards, but nothing like what she had become accustomed to spending at Bushy House. She would also receive additional sums designated for the care of their daughters, though custody of those daughters would go to William. This custody arrangement was based on cold calculation, rather than any assessment of parenting ability. William could provide better for the daughters' futures. He could introduce them to society, could arrange advantageous marriages, could give them opportunities that an actress mother, however loving, could never provide. The sons would remain with their father from the beginning, as was automatically assumed in this era for male children of any status. The actual moment of separation must have been heartbreaking. We can imagine Dorothea packing her belongings, perhaps trying to remain composed for her children's sake. We can imagine William torn between relief at solving his financial and political problems and guilt at abandoning the woman who had given him 20 years of companionship and 10 children. We can imagine the children, especially Sophia, now 15 years old and old enough to understand fully what was happening, watching their family disintegrate before their eyes. For Sophia, this was not just the loss of her mother's daily presence. It was the destruction of everything she had believed about her family and her world. She had thought, perhaps, that despite their irregular status, her parents' love was genuine and permanent, that their family was as secure as any legitimately married family. Now she learned otherwise. She learned that love, however genuine, could be sacrificed to financial necessity and political expediency. She learned that her father, However much he loved them, loved his princely dignity and political position more, she learned that in the world of royalty and aristocracy, marriage and family were not primarily about love, but about duty, status, and dynasty. The impact on Dorothea was even more severe. At age 50, she found herself cast out from the home she had occupied for 14 years, separated from most of her children, forced to start over. True, she had financial security through her allowance, but the emotional cost was devastating. She had to establish new lodgings, create a new life for herself, and figure out how to navigate a world that would judge her harshly for having been a royal mistress and would now whisper that she had been discarded when no longer useful. The children remaining at Bushy House had to adjust to life without their mother. The older ones, George, Sophia, Mary, understood to varying degrees why the separation had occurred. The younger ones, Elizabeth, Augusta, Augustus, Adolphus, Amelia, might only have understood that mother was gone and was not coming back to live with them. Nursemaids and governesses took over the maternal functions, but these employees, however competent and kind, could not replace a mother's love. Prince William himself must have struggled with guilt and doubt. He had done what he believed necessary, what duty and financial reality demanded, but the cost was high, as and the house that had been so full of life and laughter for 14 years now felt different, diminished, haunted by absence. Having made the painful decision to separate from Dorothea, William now faced the task of finding a suitable bride, someone who was royal enough to satisfy protocol, wealthy enough to help with his debts, or at least not add to them, and willing to accept a 50-something man with 10 illegitimate children and a history of living with an actress for 20 years. This proved more difficult than expected. William's first choices either rejected him or were rejected by his family. He proposed to various wealthy British women who might have brought fortune to the marriage, but they declined. Being a royal duchess was appealing, but marrying a man old enough to be their father, taking on his 10 bastard children, a man dealing with his debts, was less so. He then turned to continental princesses, the traditional source of royal brides. But here, too, there were complications. Many German Protestant princesses were available. The German states produced minor royalty in abundance, but finding one willing to accept William's particular circumstances was challenging. Some were put off by his age. He was in his 50s. Some by his 10 illegitimate children. Some by his reputation for crudeness and informality. The search dragged on through 1811 and into 1812. Meanwhile, William's debts continued to mount. Dorothea's allowance had to be paid. The children still needed support. Bushy House required maintenance. Every month brought new bills and new pressure. For Sophia and her siblings, and this period of limbo was difficult. Their father was distracted and often absent, traveling to meet potential brides or dealing with creditors and lawyers. Their mother was gone, but not entirely absent. They saw her occasionally, but these meetings were probably awkward and painful for everyone involved. The future was uncertain. Would their father remarry? What would that mean for them? Would a new stepmother be kind or cruel? Would she resent them for reminding her of William's past? Would she try to exclude them from their father's affection? These questions must have dominated conversations among the older children. Sophia, George, and Mary were old enough to understand the implications of their situation fully, and they knew that their future prospects, particularly the girls' marriage prospects, depended on maintaining respectability and good connections. They knew that their father's remarriage was probably necessary, but also threatening to their position. While William searched for a new wife and tried to manage his debts, Dorothea struggled to build a new life. She had her allowance, which should have been sufficient for comfortable living. but several factors conspired to undermine her financial security and emotional well-being. First, she was not accustomed to living on a fixed income and managing it carefully. For years, she had earned large sums from theatrical work and had spent freely, trusting that more money would come from the next performance. Now, with a fixed allowance and no ability to earn more, she found budgeting difficult. At second, she remained generous to a fault with her adult children from her earlier relationships. These children, now grown, some married with children of their own, continued to make demands on their mother's finances. Frances, her eldest daughter by Richard Daly, had married Thomas Alsop, who proved to be a financial disaster. He incurred enormous debts, some fraudulently in Dorothea's name, taking advantage of his mother-in-law's good nature and good credit. Third, Dorothea's health began to decline. Whether from stress, aging, or both, she began to suffer from various ailments, and as her health declined, so did her spirits. The separation from most of her children, the loss of the life she had built at Bushy House, the isolation of living alone, all took their toll. By 1814, Dorothea faced a crisis. The debts incurred by her son-in-law threatened to bankrupt her. Creditors were demanding payment of sums far beyond what her allowance could cover. She saw only one solution: return to the stage. If she could perform again, she could earn money to pay these debts and save her daughter's family from ruin. But this decision violated the terms of her separation agreement with William. She had agreed not to return to the theatre as a condition of receiving her allowance. William had insisted on this term, perhaps fearing that having his former mistress performing publicly would embarrass him as he sought a new wife. Dorothea chose her children over her agreement. She returned to performing in 1814. She was 53 years old, past the age when most actresses retired, but still talented and still capable of drawing audiences. She performed to earn money for Frances's debts. When William learned of this, he did exactly what the agreement permitted. He cut off her allowance. More devastating still, he took custody of the daughters who had been living with Dorothea. They were brought to Bushy House, reuniting them with their sisters, but severing their last regular contact with their mother. For 18-year-old Sophia, this development brought mixed emotions. On one hand, her younger sisters were home, and the family was more complete. On the other hand, she understood what this meant for her mother: total loss of both financial security and remaining children. Sophia was old enough to see the tragedy unfolding, to understand that her mother had made an impossible choice between children and had lost everything as a result. Dorothea performed for about a year before retiring in 1815. She had earned some money, but not enough to fully clear the debts, and now she was unemployed, without her allowance, and facing creditors' demands. Her health continued to decline. The stress and exhaustion had taken their toll. In 1815, seeing no other option, Dorothea fled to France. She settled in Saint-Cloud, a small town just outside Paris, hoping to escape her creditors and find some peace. She was essentially in hiding, living on minimal funds, separated from all her children, ill and depressed. Her last letters, preserved in various archives, speak of profound loneliness and despair. And she wrote of missing her children, of regretting the choices that had led her to this isolated exile, of wishing for death to end her suffering. These letters are heartbreaking to read, the words of a woman who had once been celebrated and beloved, now reduced to poverty and solitude in a foreign land. On July the 5th, 1816, Dorothea Jordan died in Saint-Cloud. She was 54 years old. The cause of death was not officially recorded, but was probably a combination of physical illness and profound depression. She was buried in the local cemetery at Saint-Cloud, far from England, far from the stages where she had triumphed, far from the children she had loved so deeply. News of her death reached England eventually, though probably not immediately. The theatre world that had once celebrated her noted her passing, but the attention was minimal. She had been away from the stage for years, and public memory is short. Polite society, which had never fully accepted her, probably felt vindicated. Here was proof that irregular relationships ended badly, that women who lived as mistresses eventually paid for their choices. For Sophia, now 19 years old and approaching young womanhood, news of her mother's death must have struck with devastating force. Her mother had been alive, even if separated and inaccessible. There had always been the faint hope that someday, somehow, circumstances might change, that reconciliation might be possible, that Sophia might have her mother back in some form. Now even that hope was extinguished. Sophia had lost her mother years before to the separation, but this was a different kind of loss, permanent, irrevocable, a final. She would never see her mother again, never speak to her, never embrace her, never have the chance to tell her how much she was loved and missed. That possibility was gone forever, and she had to grieve knowing that her mother had died alone, in poverty, in exile, estranged from everyone she had loved. This was not the death anyone would wish for, not dying peacefully at home surrounded by family, but dying isolated and essentially abandoned. The injustice and cruelty of it must have been almost unbearable to contemplate. Prince William did not attend any memorial service for Dorothea. He was by then fully engaged in his search for a suitable royal bride. His past was past, and he was focused on his future. But he had not forgotten Dorothea entirely. Years later, after he became king, he would commission a memorial statue of her, suggesting that his feelings, however submerged by necessity and time, remained complex and perhaps tinged with regret. Finally, after years of searching and negotiating, Prince William found a suitable bride. She was Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a small German principality that few in England could have located on a map without assistance. Adelaide was born on August 13, 1792, making her 25 years old in 1818, 27 years younger than William, who was now 52. The Principality of Saxe-Meiningen was one of the many small German states that had emerged from the complex political geography of the Holy Roman Empire. These states ranged from significant powers like Prussia and Bavaria to tiny territories that were barely larger than English counties. So Saxe-Meiningen fell somewhere in the middle, not powerful enough to play a major role in German politics, but respectable, ancient, and legitimately royal. Adelaide's father, Duke George I of Saxe-Meiningen, ruled a territory of perhaps 100,000 people. His court at Meiningen was modest by the standards of larger German courts, but it maintained proper protocol and educated its princesses in all the accomplishments expected of potential consorts for greater princes. Adelaide had been raised with careful attention to duty, propriety, and the expectations placed on royal women. She was not considered beautiful by the standards of her time. Contemporary descriptions are careful to be diplomatic, but the general consensus is that she was plain, perhaps even homely, with features that were pleasant enough but lacked the symmetry and delicacy prized in feminine beauty. She was thin rather than pleasantly plump, the preferred female figure in this era, serious rather than vivacious, pious rather than worldly. But what she lacked in beauty and charm, she made up for in character. She was genuinely kind, deeply moral without being censorious, intelligent if not brilliant, and possessed of a strong sense of duty. She understood that marriage for people of her rank was primarily a political and dynastic arrangement, rather than a love match. She was prepared to do her duty, to be a proper wife to whomever fate and politics decreed she should marry. and to accept the circumstances of her life with dignity and grace. And when the proposal came from England, from Prince William, Duke of Clarence, third son of King George III, Adelaide and her family considered it carefully. On the positive side, William was connected to one of Europe's most powerful monarchies. If the succession played out in certain ways, Adelaide might even become Queen of England someday. The financial terms offered were acceptable, and despite his age and his past with Dorothea Jordan, William was reported to be personally decent, if rather rough around the edges. On the negative side, William was 27 years older than Adelaide, old enough to be her father. He had 10 illegitimate children, whom she would be expected to accept. His financial situation was dire. His reputation included accounts of crudeness, inappropriate language, and behavior that would have been considered undignified in a German court. And of course, there was the 20-year relationship with an actress that had only recently ended. Nevertheless, Adelaide accepted the proposal. Perhaps she had few other options. At 25, she was approaching the age where unmarried princesses became embarrassing problems for their families. Perhaps she was genuinely attracted by the prospect of being connected to the British crown. Perhaps she was simply doing her duty as she understood it. Whatever her motivations, the betrothal was arranged, terms were agreed upon, and preparations were made for the wedding. The wedding itself took place on July 11th, 1818, at Kew Palace, a relatively modest royal residence in Surrey. The ceremony was quiet by royal standards. No great public spectacle, and no elaborate festivities, just a proper but subdued wedding between a middle-aged prince and a young German princess. The Prince Regent attended, along with other members of the royal family. William's children were probably present, standing in their best clothes, watching their father marry a woman who would now technically be their stepmother. For 21-year-old Sophia, witnessing this wedding must have evoked complex emotions. This woman, this plain, serious foreign princess, was now her father's wife in a way her mother had never been. Princess Adelaide's children, if she had any, would be legitimate, would have precedence over the FitzClarences, would have rights and status that Sophia and her siblings could never enjoy. The wedding made official and legal what Sophia had always understood intellectually, but perhaps not fully felt emotionally, that her mother's relationship with her father, however genuine and long-lasting, had been fundamentally different from and inferior to legitimate marriage. Yet Sophia, watching Adelaide during the ceremony and in the days and weeks that followed, found it difficult to resent her stepmother personally. Adelaide was so clearly trying to be kind, so obviously nervous about her new situation, so genuinely interested in establishing good relationships with her stepchildren, that hostility seemed both churlish and unfair. Princess Adelaide's approach to her unusual situation revealed her fundamental decency. She did not try to pretend that William's 10 illegitimate children did not exist. She did not attempt to exclude them from their father's life or affection. She did not demand that they be hidden away when visitors came or relegated to some subordinate status. Instead, from the very beginning, she treated them as part of her new family. She made efforts to know each of the children individually, to understand their personalities and interests, to show genuine care for their welfare. With the younger children, she was gently maternal, offering affection without trying to replace their lost mother. With the older children like Sophia, she was more like a friendly aunt, supportive, interested, willing to offer guidance when asked, but not forcing intimacy. This kindness, so unexpected and so graciously offered, gradually won over the FitzClarence children. They had expected, perhaps, to be treated as embarrassments or obstacles. Instead, they found themselves genuinely welcomed by their father's wife. Sophia, in particular, developed a warm relationship with Adelaide. that would last throughout both their lives. Adelaide became not a replacement for Dorothea, but a different kind of maternal figure, steadier, more consistently present, offering a different but valuable kind of support. The immediate purpose of William's marriage, to produce legitimate heirs, seemed initially promising. Adelaide conceived quickly, becoming pregnant within months of the wedding. The household at Bushy House celebrated this news. William was delighted at the prospect of finally having legitimate children. The FitzClarences probably had mixed feelings. Happiness for their father combined with awareness that legitimate children would further complicate their own status, but genuine hope that Adelaide would successfully deliver a healthy child. The first baby, a daughter named Charlotte, was born prematurely in March 1819. She lived only a few hours, dying in her mother's arms despite the best efforts of physicians and midwives. The household went into mourning. Adelaide was devastated, her first experience of motherhood ending in heartbreak. William consoled her as best he could, and they tried again. The second pregnancy came quickly. Adelaide conceived again and carried this baby closer to full term. In December 1820, she gave birth to another daughter named Elizabeth, and this baby was healthier than Charlotte had been. And for a few months, hope flourished. But Elizabeth was not thriving. She was small, weak, struggled to nurse effectively, and failed to gain weight as she should. In March 1821, just 3 months old, little Elizabeth died. Adelaide suffered 2 more miscarriages in the years that followed. Her body, it seemed, was unwilling or unable to successfully carry children to healthy term. Each loss was mourned. Each pregnancy brought hope that was subsequently crushed, and gradually it became clear that this marriage, contracted specifically to produce legitimate heirs, would not fulfill that purpose. For Sophia, watching Adelaide endure these repeated losses must have evoked profound sympathy, and Sophia was approaching the age where marriage and motherhood would be her own expected path, and seeing her stepmother's struggles gave her an early, sobering understanding of the risks and sorrows that accompanied childbearing in this era. The fact that Adelaide faced these losses with dignity and quiet courage, rather than bitterness or resentment, probably increased Sophia's respect for her stepmother. The relationship between Sophia and Adelaide strengthened through these difficult years. They were, in some ways, natural allies. Both were women navigating difficult circumstances. Both cared about William's welfare. Both were trying to find their place in an unusual family structure. Adelaide had no living children, and Sophia no living mother. Perhaps they filled needs for each other that no one else could fill. And with Adelaide established as William's wife, life at Bushy House took on a different character. The atmosphere became more formal, more properly organized, more in keeping with what one might expect in a royal household. Adelaide, raised in a German court where protocol was taken seriously, brought a sense of order and propriety that had perhaps been lacking during Dorothea's more bohemian regime. The household schedule became more regular and predictable. Meals were served at set times with proper ceremony. Morning and evening prayers became part of the daily routine, reflecting Adelaide's deep religiosity. Sundays were strictly observed as days of rest and religious devotion, with the family attending church services and avoiding frivolous entertainment. The children's education continued, and though the older ones, like Sophia, were approaching the end of their formal schooling, instead of lessons in reading and arithmetic, Sophia's education now focused on the accomplishments and knowledge needed for adult life in society. Advanced music and art, sophisticated conversation, understanding of literature and culture, and the complex social skills required to navigate aristocratic society. Sophia also began learning household management in a more systematic way. She observed how Adelaide ran Bushy House, how she managed servants, planned menus, organised entertainment, balanced accounts, and performed the 1,000 other tasks that fell to the mistress of a large establishment. These were skills Sophia would need when she eventually had her own household, and Adelaide proved a patient and thorough teacher. The social life of Bushy House also changed with Adelaide's arrival. During Dorothea's time, the social circle had included theatrical people and other bohemian elements alongside aristocrats. Adelaide, while not unkind to anyone, was more conventional in her social preferences. The gatherings at Bushy House now consisted primarily of respectable aristocratic families, military and naval officers, clergy, and other properly conventional people. This shift probably represented a gain in respectability at the cost of some liveliness and spontaneity. Adelaide's gatherings were proper, well-mannered, and thoroughly respectable. They were also perhaps less fun than the more eclectic gatherings of earlier years. But for Sophia and her siblings, this increased respectability was valuable. It helped normalize their position. I made them seem less like the offspring of a scandalous liaison, and more like ordinary members of the aristocracy who happened to have slightly unusual origins. The FitzClarence children also benefited from Adelaide's royal connections. She corresponded with other German princesses, maintained relationships with various European courts, and through these connections, the FitzClarences gained entree to social circles that might otherwise have been closed to them. Adelaide's willingness to publicly acknowledge and embrace her stepchildren lent them a legitimacy by association that was genuinely helpful. For Sophia personally, these years of her early 20s were a time of preparation and waiting. She was old enough to marry. Most women of her class married in their late teens or early 20s, but finding a suitable match for an illegitimate royal daughter was not simple. She needed a husband who was socially prominent enough to reflect well on her father, but willing to accept the complications of her birth. She needed someone whose family would not object to the connection, who saw the advantages of allying with a king's daughter, even an illegitimate one, rather than focusing on the disadvantages of her irregular status. During these waiting years, Sophia had opportunities to observe other marriages and form her own ideas about what she wanted in a husband and what kind of marriage she hoped to create. She watched Adelaide's devoted care of William despite their age difference and the disappointments of childlessness, and she saw marriages among friends and neighbours, some happy, some miserable, most somewhere in between. She began to understand that compatibility of temperament, shared values, and mutual respect might matter more than romantic passion in creating a sustainable marriage. She also observed the broader society around her and the changing times she lived in. The long war with France had finally ended in 1815 with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. The years immediately following saw Britain adjusting to peace after more than 2 decades of nearly continuous war. The economy fluctuated as wartime production ceased, and soldiers returned seeking employment. Social tensions emerged. The working classes, who had borne much of the war's burden, now demanded political voice and economic opportunity. In November 1817, an event occurred that dramatically changed the succession to the British throne and, consequently, the prospects of Prince William and his family. Princess Charlotte, the Prince Regent's only child and heir to the throne, died in childbirth at the age of 21. Charlotte had been the great hope of the nation. Young, popular, married to a prince she actually loved, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, and pregnant with what everyone hoped would be a healthy heir to continue the line of succession. She had gone into labour on November 3rd, and after more than 50 hours of difficult labour, she delivered a stillborn son. The baby, who would have been named George, never drew breath. And then, just hours after the delivery, Charlotte herself died, probably from hemorrhaging or infection. the nation went into profound mourning. Princess Charlotte had been genuinely beloved. People saw her as representing a fresh start, a new generation untainted by the scandals and failures of her father's generation. Her death, combined with that of her infant son, left the succession in crisis. The line of succession now looked like this. The Prince Regent, later George IV, had no other children, and his marriage was irretrievably broken. His next oldest brother, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, was married but childless and separated from his wife. Next came Prince William, Duke of Clarence, married to Adelaide, but as yet without surviving children. After William came Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, also childless, and Prince Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, also without children. This situation was untenable. The royal family needed heirs, and Parliament and public opinion demanded that the unmarried royal dukes marry and the married ones produce children. What followed became known as the race for an heir, the middle-aged sons of George III scrambling to marry and father legitimate children who could inherit the throne. Prince Edward married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg in 1818, and she gave birth to a daughter, also named Victoria, in May 1819. Prince Ernest married Princess Frederica of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in 1815 and had a son, George, in 1819. And William, already married to Adelaide, continued hoping that she would successfully carry a pregnancy to term. For Sophia and her siblings, Princess Charlotte's death had mixed implications. On one hand, it had increased the likelihood that their father might one day become king, which would elevate their own status. On the other hand, it also increased pressure on Adelaide to produce heirs, and each failure to do so was now nationally significant, rather than privately sad. The death also served as a stark reminder of the dangers of childbirth. Princess Charlotte had been young, healthy, and had access to the best medical care available. Yet she and her baby had died anyway. This was the reality that faced every woman who became pregnant, that childbirth could kill, that medical knowledge was limited, that even wealth and status offered no guarantees of survival. By the early 1820s, Sophia was a woman rather than a girl. She was in her mid-20s, educated, accomplished, socially adept, and increasingly aware that if she did not marry soon, she might not marry at all. In this era, women who remained unmarried past their mid-20s were beginning to be seen as spinsters, their value in the marriage market declining with each passing year. Sophia's appearance, which we can infer from portraits and contemporary descriptions, was probably attractive without being classically beautiful. She had inherited something of both parents' looks, perhaps her father's more robust features combined with hints of her mother's vivacity. She was described as having great wit, charm and gaiety, which suggests she was engaging company rather than a silent ornamental beauty. She could converse intelligently on various subjects, could play and sing pleasantly, could dance gracefully, and possess that indefinable quality of making people feel comfortable and valued in her presence. Her prospects as a potential bride were complicated by her unusual position. On the positive side, she was the daughter of a prince who might well become king. She had been raised in a royal household, educated as befitted someone of high rank, and maintained connections throughout aristocratic society. Her father, though financially strained, could presumably provide some settlement for her, and she had the advantage of Adelaide's patronage. Having a legitimate princess as stepmother lent Sophia additional respectability. On the negative side, she was illegitimate, which remained a significant social stigma regardless of her father's rank, where she had no substantial dowry. William's financial situation precluded providing his daughters with the kind of marriage portions that might attract wealthy suitors, and she was approaching the age where some potential suitors might begin to worry about her ability to bear children. Waiting until late 20s or early 30s to marry meant fewer childbearing years ahead. The pool of suitable candidates was therefore limited. She needed someone from the upper reaches of society. Connection to the royal family, however tangential, required a certain level of social standing. But she also needed someone whose family was willing to overlook or accept her illegitimacy, or someone who saw the advantages of the connection as outweighing the disadvantages. During these waiting years, Sophia probably attended numerous social events, balls, dinners, country house parties, theatre performances, and all the other occasions where young people of the aristocracy met and evaluated each other as potential matches. She would have danced with various young men, engaged in the ritualized flirtation that passed for courtship in this era, and assessed potential suitors while being assessed in return. Some young men would have been attracted to her genuine qualities, her wit, her charm, her intelligence, her ability to make conversation interesting rather than merely polite. Others might have been attracted primarily by her royal connections, seeing marriage to the king-in-waiting's favourite daughter as a social and political opportunity. Still others probably avoided her specifically because of her illegitimacy, not wanting the complications it might bring. Through all these interactions, Sophia was learning to read character, to distinguish genuine interest from opportunism, to understand what she wanted in a marriage partner. She was also learning patience and resilience, the ability to maintain hope and dignity despite repeated disappointments, to keep presenting herself as a desirable match despite the complications of her situation. At some point in the early 1820s, the exact circumstances are not recorded, Sophia met Philip Charles Shelley Sidney. The meeting might have occurred at any of the numerous social occasions that brought together the aristocracy. A ball in London, a country house party, a dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances, or perhaps through deliberate introduction by someone who thought they might suit each other. Philip was born on March 11th, 1800, making him 4 years Sophia's junior. This age difference was not unusual or problematic. Men often married women slightly older than themselves, as men generally married later than women, needing to establish themselves financially before taking on the responsibilities of a wife and family. His family background was respectable gentry, not the highest ranks of the aristocracy, but solidly established with both wealth and connections. His father was Sir John Shelley Sidney, 1st Baronet, and his mother had been Henrietta Hunloke. The family seat was Penshurst Place in Kent, one of England's finest medieval manor houses, which had been in the Sidney family since the 16th century. Most intriguingly, Philip was the first cousin of Percy Bysshe Shelley, one of the great Romantic poets. Percy's father, Sir Timothy Shelley, was the brother of Philip's mother Henrietta, who had married into the Shelley family. This connection to Percy Bysshe Shelley was simultaneously fascinating and problematic. Percy was a brilliant poet. His works like Ozymandias and Prometheus Unbound were recognized as masterpieces even during his lifetime. But he was also scandalous, an avowed atheist, a political radical, involved in complicated romantic entanglements, estranged from his family, and living in self-imposed exile in Italy. Philip had chosen to distance himself from his notorious cousin by dropping Shelley from his surname, styling himself simply Philip Sidney. This was both practical. It reduced his association with Percy's scandals, and historically resonant, as the Sidney name itself carried enormous prestige. The Elizabethan poet Sir Philip Sidney had been one of the most celebrated figures of his age, and the Sidney family maintained pride in their connection to him. Philip Sidney himself was conventional where his cousin Percy was radical. He had been educated at Eton and Christ Church, Oxford, the traditional route for young gentlemen destined for public life. He had entered politics, representing the constituency of Eye in the House of Commons as a Tory member from 1829 to 1831. He was ambitious in an entirely conventional way, seeking advancement through proper channels rather than through scandal or revolutionary thinking. We do not know what first attracted Philip and Sophia to each other. Perhaps Philip saw in Sophia a woman of intelligence and charm whose royal connections could advance his own social and political position. Perhaps Sophia saw in Philip a respectable gentleman who could give her the married status and household she desired, while not being intimidated by her unusual background. Perhaps there was also genuine mutual attraction, a meeting of minds, a compatibility of temperament, a shared sense of humor, or simply that mysterious chemistry that draws two people together. The courtship probably followed conventional patterns, carefully supervised meetings at social events, chaperoned walks or carriage rides, conversations in drawing rooms with other people present, the gradual development of mutual understanding and affection within the strict bounds of propriety. Letters might have been exchanged, though any such correspondence has been lost to history. Mutual friends and family would have been consulted, their opinions sought and weighed. For Philip, marrying Sophia meant accepting certain complications. She was illegitimate, which would require him to defend his choice to family members and social connections who might question it. She was 4 years older, which inverted the usual age dynamic in marriages, and she came with a large family of siblings who shared her unusual status, all of whom would expect some degree of connection and support. But there were also significant advantages. Sophia was the daughter of a prince who might well become king. Prince William was now second in line for the throne after his older brother Frederick, Duke of York, who was childless and in poor health. If William became king, Sophia's husband would be son-in-law to the monarch, a position of considerable influence and prestige. Additionally, Sophia herself was accomplished, intelligent, socially adept, and personally appealing, qualities that made her desirable as a wife beyond her royal connections. For Sophia, Philip represented security and respectability. He was young enough to father children, but mature enough to be established. He had family properties and a seat in Parliament. His family background was respectable without being so elevated as to make them likely to object strenuously to the match. And while we cannot know if she loved him in the romantic sense, she probably at minimum respected and liked him, which was more than many marriages of convenience could claim. The negotiations for the marriage probably involved William, Adelaide, our Philip's father, Sir John, and various lawyers and advisers. Terms would have been discussed, what financial settlement William could provide, probably modest given his perpetual financial constraints, what Philip would settle on Sophia in the event of his death, what arrangements would be made for children of the marriage, and various other legal and financial details that accompanied any aristocratic marriage. On August 13th, 1825, Sophia FitzClarence married Philip Charles Sidney in London. She was 28 years old. He was 25. The wedding marked a transformation in Sophia's identity. She was no longer simply Sophia FitzClarence, illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Clarence, but Lady Sophia Sidney, wife of Philip Sidney, Esquire, a Member of Parliament. The ceremony itself was probably held at one of London's fashionable churches, perhaps St. George's, Hanover Square, which was a popular venue for aristocratic weddings, though the specific church is not recorded. The wedding would have been respectable, but not excessively grand, befitting the marriage of an illegitimate royal daughter to a gentleman of good family, but not highest rank. Prince William certainly attended, giving his favourite daughter away. This was an emotional moment for him. His beloved Sophia, the child born when his relationship with Dorothea was still new and hopeful, now becoming a married woman and leaving his household to establish her own. The FitzClarence siblings were undoubtedly present: George, Mary, Frederick, Elizabeth, Augusta, Augustus, Adolphus, and Amelia. Some were now adults themselves, others still children, but all shared in celebrating their sister's marriage. Princess Adelaide attended as well, dressed appropriately for her position as wife of the Duke of Clarence and stepmother to the bride. Her presence lent the occasion additional respectability and demonstrated her continued support for her stepchildren. Queen Adelaide, as she would become, always treated the FitzClarences with genuine kindness, and her attendance at Sophia's wedding was another example of this generosity. Philip's family was represented by his father, Sir John Shelley Sidney, and other relatives who had made the journey to London. They were welcoming Sophia into their family, accepting her despite the complications of her birth because the advantages of the match outweighed the disadvantages. And Sophia would have worn a wedding dress appropriate to her station, probably white or cream, as white wedding dresses were becoming increasingly fashionable following their adoption by some aristocratic brides, though coloured dresses were still common. The dress would have been of fine fabric, silk or satin, cut in the style of the mid-1820s, with a moderately high waistline, puffed sleeves, and full skirts. She would have worn jewellery, perhaps gifts from her father or new husband, or family pieces borrowed for the occasion. Her hair would have been dressed elaborately, possibly decorated with flowers or ribbons. After the ceremony, there was probably a wedding breakfast, a meal served to family and close friends, with toast to the bride and groom, speeches offering best wishes and advice, and all the traditional elements of a wedding celebration. Then Sophia and Philip departed, perhaps in a carriage decorated with flowers and ribbons, to begin their married life together. Their initial destination was probably Penshurst Place, the Sidney family seat in Kent. This would be Sophia's new home, the place where she would spend much of the rest of her life, and seeing it for the first time as its future mistress must have been both exciting and daunting. Penshurst Place was, and remains, one of the most magnificent medieval manor houses in England. To understand Sophia's new life, we must understand something of this extraordinary house and its setting. The house dated primarily to the 14th century, built around 1340 by Sir John de Pulteney, a wealthy London merchant who had served as Lord Mayor of London. The centrepiece of the house was the Great Hall, constructed in 1341. A massive room with soaring ceilings, chestnut timber roof with its original medieval beams, and a central hearth that would have been used for heating and cooking when the house was new. This great hall was and is spectacular, 60 feet long, nearly 40 feet wide, and rising to a height of 60 feet at the apex of the timber roof. The scale was designed to impress, to demonstrate the wealth and power of the owner, to accommodate large gatherings of retainers and guests. Standing in this room, even centuries later, one feels the weight of history and the ambition of those who built it. The house had been modified and expanded over the centuries. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Duke of Bedford, who then owned Penshurst, and added significant new wings and upgraded the accommodations. In 1552, King Edward VI granted Penshurst to Sir William Sidney, and it had remained in the Sidney family ever since, nearly 3 centuries by the time Sophia arrived as a bride. The most famous resident of Penshurst had been Sir Philip Sidney, the Elizabethan poet, soldier, and courtier, who lived there during his youth in the late 16th century. His poetry and his heroic death in battle in the Netherlands in 1586 had made him a legendary figure, and Penshurst was forever associated with his name and memory. The house contained portraits, letters, and various artifacts connected to Sir Philip, creating a sense of living within history. By the time Sophia arrived in 1825, Penshurst was still impressive but showing its age. In medieval houses, however grand, were not comfortable by early 19th century standards. The rooms were large but draughty, difficult to heat, and often poorly lit despite numerous windows. The kitchens were far from the dining areas, meaning food arrived lukewarm at best. The servants' quarters were cramped and uncomfortable, and the whole establishment required constant maintenance to prevent decay. Nevertheless, Penshurst remained a source of pride and a symbol of the Sidney family's long history and social position. The house sat within extensive grounds that included formal gardens, parkland, and farmland. The gardens had been laid out in Elizabethan times and maintained something of their original character: geometric beds, stone walls, carefully clipped hedges, and pathways that encouraged strolling and contemplation. The village of Penshurst itself was tiny, barely large enough to be called a village at all, just a church, a few houses, and the great manor dominating everything. The church, St. John the Baptist, dated back to Norman times, with additions and modifications from nearly every subsequent century. This would be Sophia's parish church, where she would worship on Sundays, where her children would eventually be baptized, and where she herself would ultimately be buried. As the new mistress of Penshurst Place, Sophia had significant responsibilities. She was now in charge of managing the household, overseeing servants, planning meals, organizing entertainment when guests visited, maintaining the house and its furnishings, and generally ensuring that everything ran smoothly. And this was not simply a matter of giving orders and expecting obedience. It required active management, attention to detail, and the ability to balance competing demands on limited resources. The household staff at Penshurst probably included a butler to manage the male servants and oversee wine cellars and dining arrangements. There would have been a housekeeper to manage the female servants and oversee cleaning, laundry, and household supplies. There would have been footmen to serve at table and run errands, housemaids for cleaning, kitchen staff for cooking, stable hands for horses, gardeners for grounds, and various other specialized servants for specific tasks. Managing all these people, maintaining discipline while also fairness, and ensuring they performed their duties effectively was a substantial undertaking. Sophia also had social responsibilities. As wife of the local Member of Parliament and mistress of the district's great house, she was expected to participate in local society, to entertain appropriately, to show patronage to local institutions, and to represent her family with dignity and grace. This might involve hosting dinner parties for political colleagues and their wives, organizing charitable events, attending church services regularly and prominently, and generally being a visible and respected member of the local community. Within a year of marriage, Sophia was pregnant. For a woman of nearly 30 in the 1820s, pregnancy carried significant risks, but it was also the expected and desired outcome of marriage. A woman's primary duty was to provide her husband with children, ideally sons to inherit property and continue the family line, though daughters were also valued. On June 1st, 1826, less than a year after her wedding, Sophia gave birth to her first child, a daughter. The baby was named Adelaide Augusta Wilhelmina Sidney. Each name carried significance. Adelaide honoured Sophia's kind stepmother, the princess who had welcomed her and her siblings when she could have spurned them. Augusta possibly honoured Princess Augusta, one of the many royal aunts Sophia had, or perhaps the Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, who had been grandmother to King George III. Wilhelmina was the feminine form of William, honouring Sophia's beloved father, and the birth was probably attended by a midwife rather than a physician. Male doctors were rarely called to normal childbirths in this era, being reserved for complications and emergencies. Sophia would have been attended by women, the midwife, her personal maid, perhaps Adelaide or other female relatives if they were nearby, and servants to fetch water, linens, and anything else needed. The experience of childbirth in 1826 was dramatically different from what would come even 50 years later, let alone in the modern era. There was no anesthesia. Women gave birth fully conscious and feeling every moment of pain. There was limited understanding of infection. The importance of cleanliness was recognized, but the connection between specific bacteria and puerperal fever was not yet understood. There were few interventions available if something went wrong, if a baby was positioned wrong, or if bleeding became severe. Doctors could do little beyond hoping for the best. Many women died in childbirth, and even more lost babies, either at birth or shortly afterward. Infant mortality was tragically high. Perhaps 1 in 5 children died before their first birthday, many in the first few weeks of life. Every successful birth, every healthy baby, was a victory against frightening odds. Little Adelaide survived birth and her early weeks, bringing joy to Sophia and Philip. Sophia would have nursed the baby herself, or employed a wet nurse if circumstances required. Both options were acceptable for women of her class. She would have spent the traditional lying-in period of about a month recovering from childbirth, largely confined to her room, seeing only close family and female visitors, and gradually returning to normal activities as her strength returned. 2 years later, on January 28, 1828, Sophia gave birth again, this time to a son. He was named Philip Sidney, after his father, ensuring continuation of the family name. A son was particularly valued because under the laws of primogeniture that governed aristocratic inheritance, only males could inherit titles and estates. This baby boy would grow up to become the second Baron de Lisle and Dudley, would inherit Penshurst Place, and would continue the Sidney line into future generations. But between and after these successful births, Sophia experienced losses. In 1829, she had a son named Robert Dudley Sidney, who died in infancy. We do not know exactly when or how, but infant mortality was so common that these tragic losses, while deeply felt, were not considered unusual. In 1831, she had a daughter, Elizabeth Frederica Sidney, who was born and died the same year. Again, the specific circumstances are not recorded. Each loss must have been devastating. To carry a baby for months, to endure the pain and danger of childbirth, to hold your infant and begin to love it, and then to lose it. This was a uniquely terrible grief that many women in this era experienced multiple times. Sophia mourned these babies, probably attended tiny funeral services for them, and then was expected to recover both physically and emotionally and try again. In January 1834, and when Sophia was 37 years old, she gave birth to another daughter, Ernestine Wellington Sidney. The unusual middle name Wellington almost certainly commemorated Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, the great military hero who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo and who remained one of the most celebrated men in Britain. Why Sophia chose this name is not recorded. Perhaps Wellington was a friend of the family, or perhaps she simply wished to honour the national hero. Sophia's age at this birth, 37, put her in the category of what would have been considered an older mother in this era. Most women completed their childbearing by their mid-30s, and pregnancies after that age were recognized as carrying increased risk for both mother and baby. But Sophia successfully delivered a healthy baby girl who would grow up to marry and have children of her own. Between these recorded births, Sophia may have had other pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. Such losses were often not recorded, unless they occurred late enough in pregnancy to require formal burial. The physical and emotional toll of repeated pregnancies, some successful and some not, must have been enormous. Modern women who experience even one miscarriage often speak of profound grief. Sophia experienced multiple losses, while also successfully raising surviving children and managing her household responsibilities. Between pregnancies and childbirths, Sophia lived the life of a country gentlewoman, and her days followed patterns that would have been familiar to thousands of women of her class throughout England. A combination of household management, social obligations, childcare, in partnership with nurses and governesses who did much of the day-to-day work, and the various accomplishments that occupied ladies' time. Mornings typically began early. Even wealthy households rose with the sun, as candles and oil lamps were expensive, and daylight should not be wasted. Sophia would have dressed with her maid's assistants, breakfast with her husband and any children old enough to join the family table, and then begun the day's work. Household management consumed several hours each day. She would have consulted with the housekeeper about supplies needed, menus for upcoming meals, cleaning schedules, and any problems with servants. So she would have reviewed accounts, what had been spent, what bills needed to be paid, where economies might be made. She would have planned any upcoming entertainment. If guests were expected, extensive preparations were required for housing, feeding, and entertaining them appropriately. There was correspondence to maintain, letters to family members, her FitzClarence siblings, her father and Adelaide, her husband's relatives, letters to friends, letters managing various charitable and social obligations. Writing letters was a substantial undertaking in this era. It required good penmanship, proper paper, sealing wax, and careful attention to conventions of address and content. Women of Sophia's class often spent an hour or more daily on correspondence. Afternoon might bring social visits or receiving visitors. In country society, visiting between families was a primary form of entertainment and social connection. Ladies would call on each other, spending perhaps 30 minutes to an hour in polite conversation, taking tea and exchanging news and gossip. These visits followed strict protocols about who could visit whom, how long visits should last, what topics were appropriate for discussion, and how to gracefully end a visit without giving offense. When not receiving visitors, Sophia might spend time on accomplishments, practicing music — she had learned pianoforte as a girl — working on embroidery or other needlework, painting or drawing or reading. Ladies were expected to occupy their hands usefully and improve their minds through reading. Though novels were still somewhat suspect and women were encouraged to read more serious literature like history, biography, or religious works. If the weather was fine, there might be walks in the gardens or rides through the countryside. Physical exercise was considered important for health, though vigorous exertion was not considered appropriate for ladies. A gentle walk or sedate horseback ride was acceptable. Anything more strenuous would have raised eyebrows. Evening brought the family together for dinner, the main meal of the day, typically served in late afternoon or early evening. This was a formal affair even when just family was present, with proper service, appropriate dress, and conversation covering suitable topics. After dinner, the evening might be spent in the drawing room, with music, reading aloud, conversation, games, or other entertainment until bedtime. This routine was punctuated by seasonal variations and special events. Winter meant more time indoors, with longer evenings that could be devoted to reading, music, and conversation around the fire. Summer allowed for more outdoor activities, walks, rides, picnics, visits to nearby beauty spots. Spring and autumn brought their own rhythms, tied to agricultural cycles and seasonal social events. There were also regular trips to London during the social season. roughly from late winter through early summer, when Parliament was in session and fashionable society gathered in town. As wife of a Member of Parliament, Sophia probably spent several weeks or months each year in London, staying at rented lodgings or perhaps at one of William's properties. In London, the social pace was much more intense. Balls, dinners, theatre performances, opera, assemblies, and constant social visiting filled nearly every evening and much of every day. Throughout her married life, Sophia maintained close connections with her FitzClarence siblings. They had shared the unique experience of growing up as illegitimate royal children, had witnessed their mother's separation and death together, and shared bonds that drew them together despite taking different paths in adulthood. George FitzClarence, the eldest brother, had been elevated to the peerage in 1831 as Earl of Munster when their father became king. But George was troubled, possibly suffering from mental illness, perhaps porphyria, the disease that had afflicted King George III, certainly struggling with financial difficulties and contentious relationships with both his father and his wife. He and Sophia remained close, but she must have worried about him and the increasingly erratic behaviour that would eventually end in his suicide in 1842. Mary FitzClarence had married Charles Richard Fox, illegitimate son of Lord and Lady Holland, in 1824. The marriage was childless, but apparently happy enough. Mary was literary in her interests. She would eventually publish a utopian feminist novel and various other writings. She and Sophia, close in age, probably exchanged frequent letters and visited when possible. Frederick FitzClarence had followed their father into military service, joining the army and rising through the ranks through combination of ability, connections, and the advancement that came from being a king's son. He had married Lady Augusta Boyle, daughter of the Earl of Glasgow, and they had 2 daughters. Frederick's military career would eventually take him to India, where he would die in 1854 while serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Bombay Army. Elizabeth FitzClarence had made the most aristocratically brilliant marriage of any of the FitzClarence daughters. She had married William Hay, 18th Earl of Errol, in 1820. The Errols were one of Scotland's most ancient noble families, and Elizabeth became Countess of Errol. She had 4 children, and through her daughter Agnes, who married James Duff, who became 5th Earl Fife, Elizabeth would become an ancestor of numerous prominent descendants, including Princess Alexandra, Duchess of Fife, granddaughter of Edward VII, and future British Prime Minister David Cameron. Augusta FitzClarence had married the Honourable John Kennedy Erskine in 1827, and they had 3 children before his death in 1831. Augusta had remarried in 1836 to Lord Frederick Gordon. After Sophia's death in 1837, Augusta would succeed her sister as state housekeeper at Kensington Palace, a position she would hold for many years. Augustus FitzClarence had taken an unusual path for a royal bastard. He had entered the church, becoming a clergyman. He served as vicar of Mapledurham in Oxfordshire, where their father contributed generously to the parish church. Augustus married Sarah Elizabeth Catherine Gordon and had 6 children. He represented the most conventional and respectable path open to someone in his position. Adolphus FitzClarence had followed their father into the Royal Navy, rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. He commanded the royal yacht and served as naval aide-de-camp to their first cousin, Queen Victoria. Adolphus never married, remaining devoted to his naval career until his death in 1856. Amelia FitzClarence, the youngest, had married Lucius Bentinck Carey, 10th Viscount Falkland, in 1830. They had 1 son. Amelia would die in 1858, still relatively young. These siblings visited each other when possible, corresponded regularly, celebrated marriages and births together, mourned deaths together, and generally maintained the family bonds forged in childhood at Bushy House. For Sophia, these relationships provided continuity with her past and support in her present, and her siblings understood her unique position in a way that even her husband could not fully comprehend. They had lived it alongside her. On June 26, 1830, Prince William's life changed dramatically when his eldest brother King George IV died without surviving legitimate issue. George's only child, Princess Charlotte, had died in childbirth in 1817. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick had been a disaster, ending in permanent separation, and Caroline's own death in 1821. George IV died at age 67, overweight, ill, dependent on laudanum, a shadow of the handsome prince he had once been. The crown passed to Prince Frederick, Duke of York, William's next oldest brother. But Frederick was already seriously ill when George IV died, and he survived his brother by only months. And Frederick died on January 5, 1827, also without legitimate children. Now the succession fell to William, Duke of Clarence. At age 64, he became King William IV, the oldest person at that time to assume the British throne. This was not supposed to happen. Third sons of kings were not supposed to become monarchs. But Princess Charlotte's death, George IV's failure to produce surviving legitimate heirs, and Frederick's childless death had brought William to the throne despite all expectations. For Sophia, now 34 years old and mother to 2 young children, her father's accession transformed her status. She was now daughter to the reigning monarch. While still illegitimate and still unable to claim royal title, her connection to the throne was now direct and immediate, rather than speculative and distant, and King William IV's succession was greeted with generally positive public reaction. After the extravagance and scandal of George IV's reign, William's relative simplicity and straightforwardness seemed refreshing. He was known as the Sailor King because of his naval background, and this gave him a more masculine, competent image than his artistically inclined brother. He was informal in manner, walked through London unaccompanied, which shocked people used to royal hauteur, and spoke in blunt sailor's language that sometimes made courtiers cringe, but which ordinary people found appealing. One of William's first acts as king was to secure positions and recognition for his FitzClarence children. In June 1831, he created his eldest son George FitzClarence as Earl of Munster, Viscount FitzClarence, and Baron Tewkesbury. This gave George a seat in the House of Lords and formal recognition of his royal blood, even though he could never be considered truly royal. In May 1831, William raised all his daughters, including Sophia, to the rank of daughters of a marquess. This meant they would henceforth be styled as lady before their given names, though Sophia, being married, was already Lady Sophia Sidney through her marriage. The practical effect was that, in formal precedence, they would rank above women whose birth gave them lower status. It was recognition without full legitimization. They were acknowledged, but still marked as different. For Sophia's husband Philip Sidney, the king's accession brought significant benefits. In 1830, Philip was appointed as an equerry to the king, a position that brought him to court regularly and gave him access to political power. From 1833 to 1849, he served as Surveyor General of the Duchy of Cornwall, a remunerative office that helped secure the family finances. Most significantly, on January 13, 1835, Philip Sidney was raised to the peerage as Baron de Lisle and Dudley of Penshurst in the county of Kent. This made him a member of the House of Lords and gave Sophia the title she would carry for the rest of her life. Baroness de Lisle and Dudley, she was now not just Lady Sophia Sidney, but a titled peeress in her own right through marriage. Her children were born noble, assured of positions in the upper reaches of society, and this elevation came 14 years before Philip would inherit his father's baronetcy, suggesting it was a mark of royal favour specifically connected to his marriage to the king's daughter. It secured Sophia's status and gave their children noble birth, no longer merely gentlefolk, but genuine aristocracy. Throughout King William IV's reign, Queen Adelaide continued the kindness toward her stepchildren that had characterized her behavior since she first married William. She never showed resentment of the FitzClarences, never tried to diminish their importance to their father, never treated them as embarrassments or obstacles to her own position. For Sophia, Adelaide remained a source of support and affection. They exchanged regular correspondence, visited when possible, and Anne maintained the warm relationship that had developed during the years at Bushy House. Adelaide attended family celebrations, christenings of Sophia's children, birthdays, holiday gatherings, and generally behaved toward the FitzClarences as a loving aunt or even mother might. This was remarkable given the circumstances. Adelaide had lost both her own babies in infancy and had suffered multiple miscarriages. She would have been forgiven for feeling bitter toward the 10 healthy, illegitimate children who reminded everyone of William's 20-year relationship with another woman. But she showed no such bitterness. Instead, she treated them with consistent kindness and made efforts to include them in royal family life as much as protocol and their status permitted. Queen Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, continued to disapprove of the FitzClarences and tried to keep Princess Victoria, William's heir presumptive, away from them. The Duchess felt they were corrupting influences, unsuitable company for a future queen, living proof of sexual immorality. King William IV deeply resented this attitude and argued with the Duchess about it, but she remained unmoved. This tension between the King and the Duchess of Kent created uncomfortable situations. The Duchess essentially maintained a separate household at Kensington Palace, keeping Princess Victoria isolated from court life and from her FitzClarence cousins. William wanted his niece and heir to know and accept his children, but the Duchess prevented this with determination, and the conflict contributed to William's poor relationship with his sister-in-law and his worry about what would happen when Victoria inherited the throne. Despite this complication, the FitzClarence children enjoyed their father's reign. They were frequently at court, attended royal events, received pensions and positions, and generally benefited from royal favour. For Sophia, her father's affection remained constant. Even as king, William showed his preference for his eldest daughter, consulting her on various matters, inviting her to stay at royal residences, and generally treating her with the special favour she had always enjoyed. King William IV's reign was dominated by the struggle for parliamentary reform, a constitutional crisis that nearly tore the country apart and fundamentally changed British politics. Our understanding this context helps understand the world Sophia lived in during these years. The electoral system in place when William became king had not changed substantially since medieval times. Parliamentary constituencies included rotten boroughs, districts with tiny populations that nevertheless returned members of parliament, and ignored large industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham that had grown to enormous size but had no representation. Voting rights were restricted to property owners, excluding the vast majority of the population, including all women. Pressure for reform had been building for decades. The middle classes, enriched by the Industrial Revolution, demanded political voice. Working classes, increasingly literate and politically aware, agitated for representation. Radical movements threatened violence if change did not come through constitutional means. The Whig Party, led by Earl Grey, made parliamentary reform their primary platform. They won election in November 1830, shortly after William became king, with a mandate to reform the system. But the House of Lords, dominated by conservative Tories, blocked the reform bill repeatedly. The crisis came to a head in 1832. Lord Grey, frustrated by the Lords' obstruction, asked King William to create sufficient new peers sympathetic to reform to overcome the opposition. This was an extraordinary request. Monarchs rarely created more than a handful of peers at once, and creating dozens purely for political purposes would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance. William was reluctant. He wasn't naturally supportive of reform. His instincts were conservative, preferring stability to change. But he was also pragmatic and could see that refusing reform might lead to revolution. He agreed, reluctantly, to create the necessary peers if the Lords continued their obstruction. Faced with this threat, which would have permanently diminished their power by swamping their chamber with Whig appointees, the Lords finally backed down. The Reform Act of 1832 passed, expanding the franchise, redistributing parliamentary seats, and fundamentally changing British politics. For Sophia and Philip, living through this crisis meant watching political turmoil unfold. Philip had served in the unreformed Parliament and lost his seat when his constituency, was eliminated by the reforms. But other opportunities opened through his connection to the king, and the family navigated the political transformation successfully enough. The Reform Act of 1832 represents one of the major landmarks in British constitutional history. It did not create democracy. Voting rights remained restricted to property owners, excluding most working-class men and all women. But it began the process of reform that would eventually lead to universal suffrage, and it established the principle that Parliament could and should change to reflect changing society. By 1837, King William IV was clearly failing. He was 71 years old, had never been particularly healthy, and the strains of his reign had taken their toll. He suffered from respiratory problems, probably chronic bronchitis or emphysema, that made breathing difficult and caused frequent coughing fits. His heart was weakening, causing periodic episodes of chest pain and shortness of breath. Those close to the king could see he was dying. He moved more slowly, tired easily, needed frequent rest. His voice, once booming and robust, grew weaker. His appetite diminished. He lost weight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been robust, but was now becoming gaunt. Queen Adelaide devoted herself to nursing him, spending hours at his bedside, ensuring he was comfortable, managing his medicines, and providing the emotional support that cannot be delegated to servants or physicians. She had been a devoted wife throughout their marriage, and now she proved herself a devoted nurse as well. The FitzClarence children visited as much as they could, though some were distant. Frederick in India, others with their own families to manage. But they came to see their father, to spend time with him while they could, to say things that might not be said later if not said now. Sophia visited frequently during these months. She brought her children to see their grandfather and king. She spent quiet afternoons in his presence, sometimes just sitting with him while he dozed or read, providing company without demanding conversation. She painted a watercolor portrait of him, using the skills learned in childhood to capture her beloved father's features, preserving his image as his health failed. This portrait, created in the final months of his life, shows an old man, face lined with age, body diminished, but something of his essential spirit still visible in his expression. It is a tender work, showing Sophia's love for her father, and perhaps also her awareness that this image might be all she would have of him soon. During these visits, father and daughter might talk about the past, memories of Bushy House, stories from his naval days, recollections of happier times. They might discuss the present, her children, his worries about the succession, the state of the country. They might even contemplate the future, though that future was now measured in months rather than years. William worried about what would happen after his death. Princess Victoria, his heir, was only 18 years old, capable and intelligent, but very young and completely under her mother's influence. The Duchess of Kent would undoubtedly try to dominate her daughter's reign, and William distrusted the Duchess's judgment and motives. He feared for the FitzClarences under a new reign. Would Victoria, trained by her mother to view them with suspicion, continue to treat them well, or would they lose the favour and support they had enjoyed during his reign? These worries added emotional burden to physical suffering. William wanted to live long enough for Victoria to reach her legal majority at age 18, avoiding a regency where the Duchess of Kent would have even more power. He clung to life through spring 1837, determined to see Victoria come of age. In January 1837, King William appointed Sophia to a position that would be her last role, state housekeeper at Kensington Palace. And this appointment had multiple significances and was not merely an honorary title given to a favoured daughter. Kensington Palace was where Princess Victoria lived with her mother, the Duchess of Kent. The Duchess had essentially established her own court there, separate from King William's court, maintaining her isolation from what she viewed as the corrupting influence of the broader royal family. By appointing Sophia as state housekeeper, William was placing his trusted daughter in the same residence as his heir, creating a presence that might counterbalance the Duchess's influence. The position of state housekeeper was significant despite its domestic-sounding title. The state housekeeper was responsible for managing the palace's royal apartments, overseeing their maintenance, managing the servants who maintained them, ensuring everything was kept in proper order, and generally acting as the administrative authority for the domestic side of palace operations. It required someone competent, trustworthy, and capable of managing people and complex logistics. Sophia took up her duties in January 1837, moving into apartments at Kensington Palace. She probably continued to spend time at Penshurst with Philip and their children, but her primary residence was now at the palace. This meant she was closer to the centre of royal life, able to visit her father more easily, but also separated from her own household for extended periods. The work was probably both interesting and challenging. Kensington Palace was a significant royal residence, though not as grand as Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Managing its upkeep and dealing with competing demands from the Duchess of Kent's household and the King's appointments, and navigating the complex politics of a residence housing the heir to the throne. All of this required tact, intelligence, and stamina. During these months, Sophia would have encountered Princess Victoria occasionally, though the Duchess of Kent's determination to keep Victoria isolated meant these encounters were probably brief and formal. Victoria was now 17 years old, approaching her 18th birthday and legal majority. She was a small, dignified young woman, rigorously educated, strictly controlled by her mother, and probably eager for the independence that coming of age would bring. We do not know what Sophia thought of her young cousin, or what Victoria thought of Sophia. They were not close. The Duchess had ensured that Victoria had minimal contact with the FitzClarences throughout her childhood, but they were cousins, and they would both be affected by King William's approaching death, and perhaps they recognized something in each other, even across the barriers that separated them. In early spring 1837, Sophia discovered she was pregnant again. She was 40 years old, and this would be her 6th pregnancy to reach term, along with at least 2 that had ended in loss. At 40, pregnancy carried significant risks even for women with access to the best medical care available. Modern obstetrics recognizes that pregnancies after age 35 are considered advanced maternal age and carry increased risks of complications. In 1837, without modern prenatal care, without understanding of nutrition and vitamin supplements, without ability to monitor fetal development or maternal health precisely, these risks were even greater. Sophia may have had concerns from the beginning of this pregnancy. Perhaps she felt different than she had in previous pregnancies. Perhaps physicians attending her noticed warning signs, or perhaps everything seemed normal until suddenly it was not. We do not have detailed accounts of her pregnancy, only the tragic outcome. She continued her duties as state housekeeper as long as she was able, managing the palace's operations, fulfilling her responsibilities. But as spring progressed towards summer, her condition would have become obvious, and she would have gradually withdrawn from active duties, preparing for the confinement that preceded childbirth in this era. The custom of lying in meant that women in late pregnancy withdrew from society, remaining largely in their private apartments, seeing only close family and female attendants. This seclusion would last through delivery and for several weeks afterward, allowing the mother to recover before resuming normal activities. Sophia would have prepared for the birth as women had done for centuries, gathering linens and baby clothes, consulting with midwives, making arrangements for care of her existing children during and after delivery, and probably also making private prayers for a successful outcome. She knew from experience how dangerous childbirth was. She had lost babies before, and at 40, she understood she was at higher risk than she had been in her 20s. Her father's declining health added emotional burden to physical stress. King William was clearly dying. Sophia was preparing to give birth while also facing the imminent loss of her beloved father. The joy of expecting a baby was shadowed by grief over approaching loss. On April 10th, 1837, Sophia went into premature labor at Kensington Palace. The baby was not due for weeks, but labor began anyway, perhaps triggered by stress, perhaps by some physiological problem, perhaps by chance. Premature birth in the 1830s was extremely dangerous for both mother and child. The baby, born too early, was too small and underdeveloped to survive. Whether it was a boy or girl, we do not know with certainty. The records simply note a premature stillborn delivery. The tiny infant, perfectly formed but impossibly small, never drew breath, never opened its eyes, never had a chance at life. Was Sophia, exhausted from labor and devastated by the loss of her baby, now faced an even greater danger. Something went terribly wrong in the hours following delivery. Perhaps there was hemorrhaging, uncontrolled bleeding that 18th century medicine could not effectively stop. Perhaps infection set in, the dreaded childbed fever that killed so many new mothers despite attendants' best efforts to keep everything clean. Perhaps her body, exhausted by the trauma of premature labor at age 40, simply could not recover. Physicians were summoned. They would have done everything their training and experience suggested, perhaps attempted to control bleeding through pressure and ice, perhaps administered laudanum for pain, perhaps tried various medications believed to promote recovery. But their tools were limited, and their understanding incomplete, and they could not save her. Sophia FitzClarence Sidney, Baroness de Lisle and Dudley, died at Kensington Palace on April 10th, 1837. She was 40 years old. Her baby, stillborn, was buried with her. The news spread quickly through the palace, then beyond. Queen Adelaide was informed immediately. She came to Kensington to be with Sophia's body, to oversee arrangements, to provide what comfort could be offered to grieving family. Philip Sidney was summoned from Penshurst, arriving to find his wife already dead. The FitzClarence siblings were notified, a messenger riding to wherever each could be found with the devastating news that Sophia was gone, and messengers went to Windsor Castle to inform the king that his favourite daughter had died. And King William IV was at Windsor Castle when he learned of Sophia's death. He was already gravely ill, confined to his bed, struggling to breathe, knowing he had only weeks or perhaps days remaining to him. The news that Sophia had died in childbirth struck him with crushing force. Those attending the king reported that he was utterly devastated. Sophia had been his favourite child, the one who had brought him the most joy throughout her life, the one whose wit and charm had consistently lifted his spirits, the one he had loved with particular intensity among all his children. She had been part of his life for 40 years, born during the happy early days with Dorothea, growing up at Bushy House during the family's most idyllic period, surviving the separation and all the subsequent challenges, marrying well, giving him grandchildren, and remaining close to him throughout his reign. Now she was gone, and he was too ill to attend her funeral, too weak to make the journey to Penshurst, where she would be buried. He could only grieve in his bed, attended by Adelaide and servants, facing his own approaching death, with the added burden of knowing his beloved daughter had preceded him. Historians have suggested that Sophia's death hastened William's own. He was dying already. The respiratory problems and heart failure would have killed him regardless, but grief added to his suffering, removed his will to fight on, made death seem welcome rather than fearful. He had little left to live for with Sophia gone. He lingered for 2 more months, each day bringing further decline. He could barely speak toward the end, struggled to breathe, and suffered from pain that laudanum only partially relieved. Queen Adelaide remained devoted, nursing him through these final weeks with patient tenderness. On June 20th, 1837, exactly 70 days after Sophia's death, King William IV died at Windsor Castle. He was 71 years old and had reigned for 7 years. With his death, the Victorian age began, and Princess Victoria became Queen Victoria at age 18. Sophia's funeral took place at St John the Baptist Church in Penshurst, Kent, the parish church near Penshurst Place, where the Sidney family had worshipped for nearly 3 centuries. The church itself dated primarily to the 13th and 14th centuries, though parts were even older. Its stone walls had witnessed generations of Sidneys being christened, married, and buried, and now it would witness the burial of Sophia, the illegitimate daughter of a king who had married into this ancient family. The funeral was probably held within a few days of her death. Bodies were not embalmed in this era, and rapid burial was necessary, especially in April when temperatures were warming. The service would have followed the Anglican burial rite, with prayers commending Sophia's soul to God, readings from Scripture offering comfort and hope of resurrection, and hymns sung by the congregation. Philip Sidney, now a widower at 37, arranged everything. He had lost his wife of nearly 12 years, the mother of his 4 surviving children, the woman who had brought him connection to the royal family and all the advantages that came with it. Whatever his private grief, and we have no record of it, he ensured Sophia was buried with the dignity befitting a king's daughter and a baroness. The FitzClarence siblings attended in force. George, Earl of Munster, came despite his own troubled state. Mary, Elizabeth, Augusta, Augustus, Adolphus, and Amelia, all the surviving brothers and sisters who had shared Bushy House and childhood and loss of their mother, gathered to mourn their eldest sister. They had lost Sophia, who had been part of their lives since her birth, who had been the eldest daughter, who had navigated the challenges of their unusual position with such grace. Queen Adelaide probably attended if her health and duties permitted. She had loved Sophia as a daughter, had welcomed her when she could have spurned her, had maintained affection throughout the years, had shared in the joys of Sophia's children, and mourned the losses. Adelaide's presence would have been a comfort to the grieving family and a visible sign of royal favour even in death. Other attendees would have included local gentry and aristocrats, neighbours who had known Sophia as mistress of Penshurst Place, families whose lives had intersected with hers through the complex web of social connections that bound the aristocracy together. Sophia's body was interred in the Sydney Chapel at St. John the Baptist Church, a privilege of the family, a place where Sydneys had been buried for generations. Her coffin, probably of fine wood with metal fittings, was lowered into the family vault. Her stillborn baby, never named in the records, was buried with her, mother and child together in death as they had been in life. Later, a memorial was erected to Sophia in the church. It is a life-size sculpture showing her standing on a pedestal, dressed in classical-style drapery suggesting Grecian robes, holding a Bible in her hands, her eyes raised upward toward heaven. The memorial is beautiful in the idealized style of its era, showing Sophia as the epitome of virtuous womanhood. Pious, gentle, beautiful, perfectly composed. The inscription records her birth and death, her father's name and title, and her husband's name and title. It marks her as someone worth remembering, someone whose life had value, someone who should not be forgotten. And nearly 2 centuries later, visitors to St. John the Baptist Church can still see this memorial, can still read the inscription, can still contemplate the woman who died in childbirth at age 40, leaving behind a grieving family and a brief but significant life. Philip Sidney, Baron de Lisle, and Dudley was left to raise his 4 surviving children without Sophia. Adelaide was 11 years old when her mother died, old enough to remember her clearly, to feel the loss deeply, to understand that her mother was gone forever. Philip, the heir, was 9 years old enough to know what death meant, old enough to mourn, young enough to need his mother desperately. Ernestine was just 3 years old. Her memories of Sophia would be fragmentary at best, preserved more through stories told by others than through direct recollection. And Sophia Philippa, born March 11th, 1837, just a month before her mother's death, would never know her mother at all except through portraits and descriptions. For these children, and particularly the older ones, losing their mother was traumatic. She had been the organizing center of their domestic life, the one who supervised their education, arranged their schedules, provided comfort when they were hurt or frightened, maintained the household routines that gave their days structure and predictability. Now she was gone, and while nurses and governesses could provide practical care, they could not replace a mother's love. Philip Sidney eventually remarried. Practical necessity demanded it, as he needed a woman to manage his household and help raise his children. In 1850, he married Mary Foulis, who became stepmother to his children. Later, after Mary's death in 1891, he married again. He lived until 1851, dying at age 51, 14 years after Sophia. During those 14 years, he managed his estates, served in his various offices, and watched his children grow to adulthood. Adelaide Augusta Wilhelmina, the eldest child, grew up and married her first cousin, Frederick Charles, George FitzClarence Hunloke, son of George FitzClarence, Earl of Munster. This marriage kept the FitzClarence family connection strong, but produced no children. Adelaide lived until 1904, dying at age 78, having spent her entire adult life as a Victorian lady. Philip Sidney, the son and heir, inherited his father's barony, becoming the second Baron de Lisle and Dudley. He married Mary Foulis, his father's second wife's namesake, who was actually his stepmother's relative, and had 5 children, continuing the family line. Philip II lived until 1898, dying at age 70. His son Philip III continued the line, and eventually the title passed down to Philip IV, who was created Viscount de Lisle in 1956. The current Viscount de Lisle, descended directly from Sophia through her son Philip, still lives at Penshurst Place. Ernestine Wellington Sidney married Philip Percival and had 4 children. Her line continues through her descendants, carrying Sophia's blood through the British aristocracy in multiple branches. Sophia Philippa Sidney, who never knew her mother, grew up and married Alexander, Graf von Kielmansegg, a German nobleman descended from another illegitimate royal line, the Walmoden-Gimborne family, descended from George II. They had no children, so this line ended. Through her surviving children and through their descendants, Sophia's bloodline spread throughout the British and European aristocracy. Her descendants include numerous noble families, politicians, soldiers, and others who have played various roles in British history over the past 2 centuries. The current Viscount de Lisle, living at Penshurst Place nearly 200 years after Sophia's death, represents the direct continuation of her line through her son Philip. Just 11 weeks after Sophia's death, her cousin Victoria became queen at age 18. Victoria's reign would last 63 years and give its name to an entire era, the Victorian Age, characterized by industrial progress, imperial expansion, strict moral codes, and unprecedented social change. The FitzClarence siblings might have worried about how they would be treated under the new regime. Victoria's mother, and the Duchess of Kent, had made no secret of her disapproval of them, and had kept Victoria carefully separated from her illegitimate cousins throughout her youth. There was real possibility that Victoria, trained by her mother to view the FitzClarences with suspicion, might exclude them from court or reduce the favours and pensions they had enjoyed during her uncle's reign. But Victoria surprised everyone. Despite her mother's influence, despite her youth, despite having been kept isolated from the FitzClarences throughout her childhood, Victoria showed them genuine kindness. She allowed the surviving siblings to maintain their positions and privileges. She kept Adolphus as commander of the royal yacht. She welcomed them at court on appropriate occasions. She mentioned them in her diaries and letters without particular criticism or contempt. This generosity of spirit suggests that Victoria understood something important, that the FitzClarence children were not responsible for the circumstances of their birth, that they deserved to be treated with dignity despite their irregular origins, that they were her cousins and family regardless of legitimacy. Perhaps Victoria, who had grown up without a father and with a difficult, controlling mother, felt some sympathy for people whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. Victoria's kindness allowed the FitzClarences to maintain their social positions and live out their lives with dignity. George, Earl of Munster, despite his troubled mental state, retained his title until his suicide in 1842. The other siblings married respectably, had children, participated in society, and generally lived the lives of ordinary aristocrats. Their illegitimacy remained a permanent mark, but it did not prevent them from finding places in Victorian society. As the years passed and the FitzClarence generation aged, they passed from the scene one by one. Augustus died in 1854, Frederick in 1854, the same year, different months, Elizabeth in 1856, Adolphus in 1856, Amelia in 1858, Mary in 1864, and Augusta in 1865. By the mid-1860s, only the descendants remained, the children and grandchildren of William IV and Dorothea Jordan, carrying their genes and their memory into future generations. Penshurst Place still stands, and nearly 8 centuries after its great hall was first built. It remains in the Sidney family. The current Viscount de Lisle, direct descendant of Sophia through her son Philip, lives there and opens the house and gardens to visitors. Walking through Penshurst today, one walks through rooms that Sophia knew, sees views she saw, treads paths she walked. The great hall, with its magnificent chestnut timber roof and central hearth, remains much as it was when Sophia first saw it in 1825. The scale and craftsmanship still impress. The sense of history still weighs heavy in the air. This was where the family gathered for formal occasions, where important guests were received, where the Sydney legacy was displayed and celebrated. The staterooms, furnished with antiques and portraits accumulated over centuries, they still show the elegance of aristocratic life. There are portraits of various Sydneys throughout history, including some from Sophia's era. There are furnishings she might have used, books she might have read, instruments she might have played. The past feels close here in a way it rarely does elsewhere. The gardens, laid out in Elizabethan times and carefully maintained ever since, still bloom according to ancient patterns. Geometric beds edged with low hedges, paths that invite strolling, views carefully composed to please the eye. These remain much as they were when Sophia walked here with her children or her husband, perhaps discussing household matters or simply enjoying the beauty of a summer day. And in St. John the Baptist Church, just a short walk from the house, Sophia's memorial still stands. Visitors can see it and can read the inscription, can contemplate the sculptured figure of a woman who died nearly 200 years ago. The memorial has weathered well, the stone still crisp, the figure still graceful, the inscription still legible. It serves its purpose of memory, ensuring that Sophia is not forgotten, that her brief life is acknowledged and honoured. The FitzClarence family's legacy extends beyond Sophia's immediate descendants. Through the marriages of her siblings, William IV and Dorothea Jordan's blood spread throughout the British aristocracy and beyond. Today, hundreds, if not thousands of people can trace their ancestry back to the FitzClarences, and through them to King William IV. Some descendants are notable. Princess Alexandra, Duchess of Fife, and her sister Princess Maud, and Countess of Sussex, granddaughters of King Edward VII, descended from Elizabeth FitzClarence through her daughter Agnes, who married James Duff, 5th Earl Fife. David Cameron, who served as British Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, also descends from the FitzClarences through Elizabeth's line. Duff Cooper, 1st Viscount Norwich, who served in various cabinet positions and was a noted author and diplomat, descended from the FitzClarences. Various other nobles, politicians, military officers, and ordinary citizens carry FitzClarence blood. This diaspora of descendants means that William IV, who had no surviving legitimate children, nevertheless has numerous descendants. They just trace their lineage through the illegitimate line, rather than through legitimate succession. The irony is that William's legitimate wife, Adelaide, failed to produce surviving children despite multiple pregnancies, while his illegitimate partner, Dorothea, gave him 10 healthy children, who survived to adulthood and had children of their own. The FitzClarence story also tells us something important about illegitimacy and social class in Georgian and early Victorian England. Illegitimate children of aristocrats, if acknowledged by their fathers and given support, could often integrate into society quite successfully. They faced stigma and limitations, but they were not completely excluded. The FitzClarences, despite being illegitimate, married into noble families, held positions at court, received titles and honours, and generally lived lives of privilege and opportunity. This was possible only because of their father's status and his willingness to acknowledge and support them. Illegitimate children of ordinary people faced far harsher treatment: social ostracism, economic hardship, legal disadvantages. But aristocratic bastards, if properly supported, could navigate their world with relative success. Looking back across nearly 2 centuries at Sophia FitzClarence's life, What lessons can we draw? What does her story teach us about human experience, about resilience, about navigating difficult circumstances with grace and dignity? Perhaps we can learn something about the power of parental love to shape children's lives. Sophia's father loved her throughout her life, called her his favorite, and his love gave her confidence and security despite her irregular status. That love, combined with the early years of maternal affection before the separation from Dorothea, created a foundation that sustained Sophia through the challenges she faced. She knew she was loved, knew she mattered to her parents, and that knowledge helped her maintain dignity and purpose, even when circumstances were difficult. Perhaps we can learn something about the importance of character in navigating social difficulties. Sophia was described as having great wit, charm, and gaiety, qualities that made people enjoy her company and helped her create connections despite her illegitimacy. Her personal qualities mattered more than her irregular birth in determining how people responded to her. In a world that should have shunned her, she created space for herself through force of personality and genuine warmth. Perhaps we can learn something about the randomness of fate and the limits of human control. Sophia did everything right by the standards of her era. She made a suitable marriage, bore children, managed her household competently, fulfilled her social and family obligations. Yet she died at 40 in childbirth, leaving orphan children and a grieving family. Her death was not punishment for any transgression, not divine judgment on illegitimacy, just the cruel randomness of biology and the limitations of medical knowledge in her time. Perhaps we can learn something about the persistence of love across unconventional circumstances. William and Dorothea created something real during their 20 years together. Not a legal marriage, but a genuine family built on affection and mutual support. Their children, including Sophia, were proof that families could exist and thrive outside conventional forms, that love could transcend the rigid social categories of their era. Perhaps we can learn something about the cost of social change and the sacrifices required when old forms give way to new necessities. The separation of William and Dorothea, which devastated Sophia's childhood, was driven by forces beyond any individual's control. Financial pressures, succession requirements, social expectations. Individual happiness was sacrificed to larger considerations, and children paid the price of their parents' inability to marry legally. Or perhaps we simply learn that every life, however distant in time, has inherent value and dignity. Sophia FitzClarence was not a queen, not a reformer, not a person who changed history through great deeds. She was simply a woman who lived as best she could within the circumstances she inherited, who loved and was loved, who brought happiness to those who knew her, and who died too young, leaving grief in her wake. In this ordinariness, if we can call a king's daughter's life ordinary, there is something universal that connects us across centuries. And now, dear sleepy listener, we come to the end of our long, peaceful journey through Sophia FitzClarence's life. We have walked with her from her birth in that London townhouse in 1796, through the golden years of childhood at Bushy House, through the painful separation from her mother and Dorothea's tragic death, through her marriage and motherhood, through her father's reign as king, and finally to her death at Kensington Palace in 1837. We have seen her world, Georgian and early Victorian England, a nation at war and then at peace, undergoing tremendous changes from agricultural society to industrial power, from restricted to expanding franchise, from the old certainties to new possibilities. We have met the people who shaped her life: her father William, sailing prince and eventual king; her mother Dorothea, actress and beloved partner; her stepmother Adelaide, kind and generous despite having every reason for resentment; her husband Philip, providing security and respectability; her children, carrying her memory and her bloodline forward. Sophia's life was marked by both privilege and limitation, by love and loss, by security and uncertainty. She knew the comfort of great houses and beautiful grounds, but also the stigma of illegitimate birth, and she enjoyed her father's love and favour, but lost her mother to separation and then to death. She married respectably and had children, but died in childbirth before she could see those children grow to adulthood. Through it all, she maintained what contemporary accounts describe as great wit, charm and gaiety, the ability to make others feel comfortable and valued, to bring light and laughter into rooms she entered, to navigate her unusual position with grace rather than bitterness. This achievement, more than any formal accomplishment, defined her character and explains why those who knew her loved her. As you drift towards sleep now, dear listener, carry with you the image of Sophia, running through Bushy Park as a child, learning her lessons under tutors' guidance, mourning her mother's death with teenage heartbreak, as standing in her wedding dress on her marriage day, holding her newborn babies, managing her household at Penshurst, painting her father's portrait in his final illness. See her as fully human, complex and real, worthy of memory despite living 2 centuries ago and dying young. Remember that every person's life has value, that everyone who has lived deserves to be remembered with respect and compassion, that the past is not just dates and events, but millions of individual human experiences like Sophia's, some recorded, most lost, but all real and all important. And remember that love persists across time and circumstance. The love William felt for Sophia, the love she felt for her children, the love Philip felt for his wife, the love between siblings forged in shared experience. All of this was real, all of it mattered, and all of it echoes down through the centuries to touch us even now as we hear Sophia's story. May her memory be a blessing. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. May your dreams be gentle. And may you wake refreshed, carrying forward into your own life some fragment of the grace and resilience that Sophia showed in hers. The story of Sophia FitzClarence, Baroness de Lisle and Dudley, has drawn to its quiet close. Born in 1796 to a prince and an actress, raised in the beautiful grounds of Bushy House, marked by illegitimacy but sustained by her father's love, navigating the loss of her mother and the complexities of her social position, marrying respectably and bearing children, honoured during her father's reign, and dying in childbirth at age 40 in 1837. This was her life's arc, a complete and finished nearly 2 centuries ago. She left behind children who carried her bloodline forward through generations, descendants who still live today. She left behind memories in those who knew her, memories of wit and charm, of kindness and grace, of a woman who made her world better by her presence in it. And she left behind this story, preserved in historical records and family memories, available now for us to remember her by and to honour her memory. Thank you for joining me on this detailed, peaceful journey through Sophia's life. If you found comfort in this tale, if her story touched you in some way, please consider liking this video, subscribing to Sleepy Crown for more gentle historical narratives, and leaving a comment about what resonated with you in Sophia's story. Sleep well, dear listener. Dream peacefully, and wake knowing that every life past and present, famous and obscure, long and short, has value and deserves to be remembered with compassion. Until we meet again in another story, another time, another gentle journey through history's quiet tales. Good night and gentle sleep.